Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take one of the most well-known characters in all of animation and look at him through the eyes of a psychologist. And that character is Glenn Quagmire from Family Guy. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking. Quagmire? The giggity guy? What is there to actually break down? He's just the creepy neighbor who chases women and says weird things. And I completely understand why people see him that way, because for a long time, that really was all he seemed to be. But what I want to argue today is that Glenn Quagmire is actually one of the most emotionally complex and psychologically damaged characters in the entire show. Almost everything he does, from the way he treats women, to the way he acts around his friends, to the rare moments where he actually lets his guard down and shows real emotion, all of it points back to a man who is carrying deep pain, deep loneliness, and a lifetime of experiences that shaped him into who he is. A psychologist looking at this character wouldn't just see a joke. They'd see someone who uses humor and obsession as a way to avoid dealing with what's really going on inside. And throughout this video, we're going to go through it all. His childhood, his family, his friendships, his patterns, and the moments where the real Quagmire actually comes through. By the end, I think you're going to look at this character in a completely different way. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The man behind the giggity. So let's start with the basics. Who is Glenn Quagmire when you first meet him on Family Guy? What does the average viewer actually see? On the surface, the answer is pretty simple. Quagmire is one of Peter Griffin's 3 closest friends. He lives right there on Spooner Street in the same neighborhood as the Griffin family. He spends most of his free time sitting at a booth inside the Drunken Clam, which is the local bar where he hangs out with Peter, Joe Swanson, and for a good chunk of the show, Cleveland Brown. When Cleveland moves away to his own spin-off show, the group keeps going as a trio, but the dynamic at that booth stays the same. It's where these 4 guys, or 3 guys depending on the season, sit around, drink beer, and talk about their lives. And Quagmire is always right there in the middle of it. His job is actually a pretty impressive one. Quagmire works as a commercial airline pilot. That's not a small thing. Being a pilot takes training, discipline, and skill. It's a career that most people would respect, and the show does reference his job fairly often. We see him in his pilot uniform, we see him heading off to flights, it comes up in conversations. So on paper, Quagmire is a working professional with a steady career and a home in a quiet neighborhood. That doesn't sound like someone who would need a psychologist at all. But then there's the other side of him, the side that everyone knows. Quagmire's most famous trait, and the thing that defines him more than anything else, is his obsession with women. This is the core of his character in the early seasons of the show. Almost every joke involving Quagmire comes back to this one thing. He shows up in a scene, he makes some kind of comment about a woman, he says giggity, and that's the punchline. It happens over and over and over again. His entire personality in those early years is built around this single idea, that he is completely and totally obsessed with women to a degree that goes way beyond what any normal person would consider acceptable. And for the first several seasons of Family Guy, that really was all Quagmire was. He existed as a punchline. He was the funny neighbor who would pop into a scene, do or say something outrageous, and then the story would move on. Nobody was sitting there thinking about why Quagmire was the way he was. Nobody was wondering about his childhood or his family or what was going on in his head. He was just the giggity guy, a joke machine. And honestly, it worked. People laughed. The character was popular. His catchphrase became one of the most recognizable things in all of animated television. If you walk up to almost anyone who has even a passing knowledge of Family Guy and you say giggity, they know exactly who you're talking about. But here's where things start to get interesting. As Family Guy went on and the show started to mature in its own way, the writers began doing something that they hadn't really done with Quagmire before. They started giving him real storylines. Not just quick jokes or one-off gags, but actual episodes where Quagmire was the focus. Episodes where we learned things about his past. Episodes where we saw him react to real serious situations. And as those episodes started to pile up season after season, something became very clear. There was a lot more going on with this character than anyone had originally thought. The first thing a psychologist would probably notice about Quagmire is that his behavior follows a pattern, and that pattern is not random. It's not just that he likes women. It goes much deeper than that. If you actually sit down and watch his behavior across the full run of the show, you start to notice that Quagmire uses his obsession with women as a way to fill something. There's an emptiness to him that the show hints at again and again, sometimes through jokes and sometimes through genuinely serious moments. He lives alone. He doesn't have a long-term partner. partner. He doesn't have a stable family life in the way that Peter does, or even in the way that Joe does. His house is right next to the Griffins, and every single day he can look out his window and see a family, a husband, a wife, kids, a dog. All the things that deep down Quagmire doesn't have. And while the show plays this for comedy most of the time, there are moments where you can see that it actually bothers him. A psychologist would call this a coping pattern. When someone is dealing with something painful inside, whether it's loneliness or sadness or a feeling of not being enough, they often develop behaviors that help them avoid that pain. Some people throw themselves into work. Some people drink too much. Some people push everyone away so they don't have to risk getting hurt. And some people, like Quagmire, chase after short-term connections because the idea of a real, lasting one is too frightening or too painful to deal with. It's not that Quagmire doesn't want love. It's that something inside him makes it almost impossible for him to actually hold on to it when it shows up. And the show gives us evidence of this. There are episodes throughout the series where Quagmire does actually fall for someone. Not in the shallow, surface-level way that he usually acts, but in a real way. There are moments where he meets a woman and genuinely cares about her, where he tries to be a good partner, where he opens up emotionally in a way that we almost never see from him. And almost every single time it falls apart. Something goes wrong. The relationship doesn't work out. And Quagmire goes right back to his old patterns. Right back to the jokes, right back to the giggity. It's a cycle. And any psychologist watching this would recognize it immediately because it's one of the most common things they see in people who are afraid of real closeness with another person. But the question is, where does this come from? Why is Quagmire like this? People don't just wake up one day and decide to be emotionally closed off. They don't just randomly develop patterns of chasing short-term attention while running away from anything real. Something causes it. Something in their past, usually in their childhood or in their family, plants the seed for that kind of behavior. And this is where Quagmire's story gets really interesting, because the show actually does give us a look into his family, and what we find there explains a lot. We know from the show that Quagmire's upbringing was far from normal. His family situation is one of the most unusual in the entire series, and the things he went through growing up, the things he saw, the things he experienced, they line up almost perfectly with the kind of person he became as an adult. A psychologist would look at Quagmire's childhood and immediately start connecting the dots. They'd see a direct line between what happened to him when he was young and the way he behaves now. It wouldn't be a mystery to them at all. In fact, they'd probably say it would be more surprising if Quagmire had turned out normal, given everything he went through. Now, the show doesn't lay all of this out in one neat episode. You have to piece it together across multiple seasons and multiple storylines. But when you do, the picture that forms is pretty clear. Quagmire didn't just become this way out of nowhere. He was shaped by his environment. He was shaped by his family. He was shaped by experiences that most kids never have to go through. And every single one of those experiences left a mark on him that he carries into his adult life, whether he realizes it or not. This is something that a psychologist would find very important. One of the biggest ideas in the field of understanding why people behave the way they do is that our childhood has a massive effect on our adult personality. The way we were raised, the people who raised us, the things we saw and experienced when we were too young to fully understand them, all of that gets stored inside us. It doesn't just disappear. It stays there, shaping the way we see the world, the way we handle relationships, the way we deal with stress and pain and fear. And for Quagmire, his childhood gave him a very specific set of experiences that pushed him in a very specific direction. The casual fan watches Quagmire say giggity and laughs, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is funny. The show is a comedy, and it's supposed to make you laugh. But the deeper you look at this character, the more you start to realize that the comedy is sitting on top of something much heavier. The laughs are there, but underneath them is a person who is struggling in ways that most people never stop to think about. And that's what makes Quagmire such a fascinating character to analyze. He's not just a joke. He never was. He's a case study in how pain shows up in the strangest, most unexpected ways. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And to really understand that, we need to go back to where it all started, because Quagmire's family is where the roots of all this damage were first planted. Section 2. The Quagmire family, where the damage began. At the end of the last section, we talked about how Quagmire didn't just become the person he is out of thin air. Something in his past, something in his family, planted the seeds for all of the behavior we see from him as an adult. And when you actually go through the episodes of Family Guy that deal with Quagmire's family, it becomes very clear very quickly that this man did not grow up in anything close to a normal household. In fact, his family situation is one of the most unusual and one of the most emotionally complicated of any character on the entire show. And a psychologist looking at it would have a field day, because almost everything about Quagmire's adult life can be traced directly back to what happened in this family. So let's start with his father. For years, viewers of Family Guy knew very little about Quagmire's dad. He was barely mentioned. Quagmire's personal life was mostly played for jokes, and the show didn't really dig into where he came from. But that changed in a big way in Season 8 in an episode called Quagmire's Dad. In that episode, we're introduced to Dan Quagmire, Glenn's father. Dan is a Navy veteran. He served in the military, which is a respectable background and suggests a certain kind of upbringing for Glenn. You'd expect someone raised by a military father to grow up in a disciplined, structured household. And maybe there were elements of that. But the episode takes a major turn when Dan reveals that he is going to undergo a sex reassignment surgery and transition. Dan becomes Ida Davis. Now, this episode is important for a lot of reasons, but the one that matters most for understanding Quagmire is his reaction. When Dan tells Glenn about the transition, Quagmire does not take it well. He's shocked, he's confused, he struggles with it in a very visible, very emotional way. This is one of those rare moments in the show where we see Quagmire drop his usual act completely. There's no giggity. There are no jokes. There's no chasing after women or trying to be the funny guy. Instead, we see a man who is genuinely shaken by something happening in his family. He doesn't know how to process it. He doesn't know how to react. And he goes through a real emotional struggle trying to figure out how he feels about his parents' decision. A psychologist watching this would notice something very important. Quagmire's reaction isn't just about his father's transition. It's about the fact that someone he thought he knew, someone who was supposed to be a stable figure in his life, turned out to be someone different than who he believed them to be. And for a person like Quagmire, who already has deep issues with trust and closeness and letting people in, this would hit especially hard. It reinforces something that a psychologist would say Quagmire probably already felt deep down, that the people closest to you can change, can surprise you, can become someone you don't recognize. And if you already have trouble trusting people, something like that makes it even harder. Eventually, Quagmire does reach a point where he begins to accept Ida. It's not instant, it's not easy, but the show does bring Ida back in later episodes, and over time, Glenn's relationship with his parent settles into something more stable. But that initial shock, that feeling of the ground shifting under his feet when it comes to his own family, that's the kind of experience that leaves a mark. And when you're already someone who avoids deep emotional connections, having your own parent become someone unfamiliar to you only makes that pattern stronger. But if Quagmire's father is one piece of the puzzle, his mother is the piece that arguably explains the most. In Season 13, in an episode called Quagmire's Mom, the show finally gives us a real look at Glenn's mother, Crystal Quagmire. And what we learn in that episode is one of the most important things we ever learn about why Quagmire is the way he is. In that episode, Quagmire gets into serious legal trouble. He's facing real consequences. And when things look bad, his mother Crystal shows up. Now, you might expect a mother to show up and hire a lawyer, or give her son a speech about responsibility, or try to help in some normal, reasonable way. But that's not what Crystal does. What Crystal does is use her own sexuality to fix the problem. She sleeps with the judge handling Quagmire's case in order to get the charges against him dropped. And here's the thing that makes this so important. The episode makes it very clear that this is not the first time Crystal has done this. This has been her way of handling things for Quagmire's entire life. When he got in trouble at school, she would sleep with his teachers or his principal to make the problem go away. When he faced consequences for something he did, she would step in and use sex as a tool to fix it. Over and over and over again, from the time Quagmire was young, this was the pattern. His mother taught him, without ever sitting him down and saying it directly, that sex was a transaction, that it was something you could use to get what you wanted, that it was the solution to problems. that it was in many ways the most powerful currency a person could have. Now think about that from a psychologist's point of view. Imagine you're a child growing up in that environment. Your mother doesn't solve problems through conversation or hard work or facing consequences head on. She solves them through sex. That's the lesson you absorb every single day. That becomes your understanding of how the world works. And when that child grows up, what kind of adult do you think they become? They become someone who sees sex not as something connected to love or trust or emotional closeness, but as something separate from all of that. Something that exists on its own. Something casual. Something that can be used. Something that doesn't need to mean anything. And that is exactly who Quagmire is. A psychologist would look at Crystal Quagmire's influence on her son and immediately connect it to his adult behavior. The reason Quagmire treats relationships the way he does, the reason he chases short-term encounters and runs from anything meaningful, isn't just because he's some shallow character without depth. It's because his own mother taught him from a very young age that sex and love are two completely different things. That sex is a tool, not an expression of feeling. He learned this before he was old enough to question it. It became part of how he sees the world, and by the time he was an adult, that lesson was so deeply planted inside him that he probably doesn't even realize it's driving his behavior. He just thinks this is who he is. He just thinks this is how he's wired. But a psychologist would tell you that nobody is wired that way from birth. This was taught. This was learned. And it was learned from the person who was supposed to protect him and teach him how the world really works. And then there's Quagmire's sister. Brenda Quagmire shows up in season 10 in an episode called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. This is one of the darkest and most serious episodes in the entire history of Family Guy. It's an episode that barely feels like a comedy at all. When Brenda comes to visit, it becomes very clear very quickly that she's in a deeply abusive relationship with her boyfriend, Jeff Feckelman. Jeff controls her, he hurts her, he manipulates her. And everyone around Brenda can see it. Peter can see it, Lois can see it, Joe can see it, and Quagmire can absolutely see it. And this is where we see a completely different side of Quagmire. The giggity is gone. The jokes are gone. The chasing women is gone. What we see instead is a brother who is terrified for his sister's safety. Quagmire is angry. He's worried. He's desperate to get Brenda away from Jeff. He tries talking to her. He tries to make her see what Jeff is doing to her. But Brenda keeps going back. She keeps defending Jeff. She keeps making excuses. And watching this tears Quagmire apart from the inside. This episode matters for two big reasons. The first is that it shows us what Quagmire is like when someone he truly loves is in danger. All of the surface level stuff falls away. The act disappears. And what's left is a man who cares so deeply about his sister that he's willing to do anything to protect her. It shows us that underneath everything, Quagmire is capable of deep, real, genuine love. He's not empty inside. He's not a machine who only cares about himself. When it comes to his sister, he's as real and as raw as any character on the show. The second reason this matters is what it tells us about the Quagmire family as a whole. Brenda ending up in an abusive relationship is not a coincidence when you look at the family she comes from. She grew up in the same household as Glenn. She had the same parents. She was shaped by the same environment. And just like Glenn developed unhealthy patterns around relationships, Brenda did too. Hers just looked different. Where Glenn runs from real connection and keeps everything shallow, Brenda went in the opposite direction. She attached herself to someone who gave her attention and validation, even though that person was hurting her. She couldn't leave because, on some level, she believed this was what she deserved. Or, she believed this was what love looked like. A psychologist would look at both Glenn and Brenda and see two children from the same broken household who developed completely opposite but equally unhealthy ways of dealing with relationships. Glenn avoids love by keeping everything casual and meaningless. Brenda clings to love even when it's destroying her. They're on opposite ends of the same broken line. And that broken line leads straight back to the household they grew up in. Straight back to Dan and Crystal Quagmire. Straight back to a family that never taught either of these kids what a healthy relationship actually looks like. This is what makes the Quagmire family so important to understanding Glenn. It's not just one thing. It's not just his mother. It's not just his father. It's not just watching his sister suffer. It's all of it. Every piece of his family gave him a different wound, and every wound pushed him further into the patterns we see as an adult. The mother who taught him sex was a transaction. The father whose identity shift shook his sense of stability. The sister whose suffering showed him what love can turn into when it goes wrong. All of these experiences stacked on top of each other, year after year, and they built the Glenn Quagmire that we know today. And a psychologist wouldn't be surprised by any of it. They would look at this family history and say, yes, of course this is who he became. Given everything he went through, the surprising thing wouldn't be that Quagmire has problems. The surprising thing would be if he didn't. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But understanding where the damage came from is only the first step. What matters next is looking at how that damage actually shows up in Quagmire's daily life. And the clearest place to see it is in the way he handles his relationships with women. Because that's where all of this pain and all of these broken lessons play out over and over and over again. Section 3. The Pattern. Quagmire and Women. In the last section, we talked about the Quagmire family and how Glenn's upbringing gave him a deeply broken understanding of relationships, love, and what sex actually means. His mother, Crystal, taught him from a young age that sex was a tool, something you use to get what you want, not something connected to real emotional closeness. His father's transition shook his sense of stability. And watching his sister Brenda suffer in an abusive relationship showed him the ugliest side of what love can turn into. All of these experiences shaped him. And the place where that shaping is most obvious, the place where all of that damage plays out on a daily basis, is in the way Glenn Quagmire deals with women. Because if there's one thing that defines Quagmire more than anything else across the entire run of Family Guy, it's this. And when you actually stop and look at the pattern, when you line up all the episodes and all the moments and all the choices he makes, you start to see something that goes way beyond just a character who likes women. You start to see someone who is stuck in a cycle that he can't break out of. And that cycle tells you more about what's going on inside his head than almost anything else. So let's break it down. The most basic and most obvious thing about Quagmire is that he goes through women at an unbelievable rate. This is the surface level joke that the show has been running since the very beginning. Quagmire is always pursuing someone new. He's always at a bar, or at a party, or in some random situation where he spots a woman and immediately locks on. One episode to the next, it's always someone different. There's never any continuity. There's never a last week I was seeing someone. It's just a never-ending series of short-term encounters that mean nothing to him the moment they're over. He moves from one to the next with no pause, no reflection, and no emotional connection. Now, on its own, the show plays this for laughs. And it is funny. The speed at which Quagmire operates, the way he can be interested in someone 1 second and completely moved on the next, the giggity that signals the start of every new chase, it's all comedic. But if you look at it from a psychological angle, what you're actually seeing is someone who is addicted to the chase itself. It's not really about the women. It never has been. It's about the feeling Quagmire gets when he's pursuing someone new. That feeling of excitement, that rush, that moment where everything else in his life fades away and all he's focused on is this one thing. That's what he's actually chasing. And the reason he has to do it over and over and over again is because the feeling never lasts. The second the chase is over, the emptiness comes back. So he starts again, and again, and again. A psychologist would recognize this immediately. It's a cycle that a lot of people fall into, not just in the way Quagmire does, but in general. When someone has unresolved pain or loneliness inside them, they often find something external that gives them a temporary feeling of relief. For some people, it's shopping. For some people, it's gambling. For Quagmire, it's the pursuit of women. And just like any other cycle like this, it never actually fixes the underlying problem. It just covers it up for a little while. And then you need to do it again. And the more you do it, the more you need it, and the harder it becomes to stop. But here's the part that really proves this is about more than just surface level behavior. Because the show doesn't just give us Quagmire chasing random women, it also gives us episodes where Quagmire actually has the chance to have something real. And what happens in those episodes tells you everything you need to know about where his head is at. One of the most important episodes for understanding this pattern is I Take Thee, Quagmire from season 4. In this episode, Quagmire meets a woman named Joan and actually marries her. Now, think about that for a second. Quagmire, the man who has spent the entire show avoiding any kind of commitment, who has never stuck with anyone for longer than a single episode, actually gets married. He walks down the aisle. He says the vows. He commits. And for a brief moment, it seems like maybe this is the turning point. Maybe this is the episode where Quagmire finally breaks out of his pattern and builds something lasting. But that's not what happens. Almost immediately after the wedding, Quagmire starts to panic. The reality of being tied to one person, of being in a committed relationship where he can't just walk away whenever he wants, it overwhelms him. He doesn't settle into married life. He doesn't find peace in it. Instead, he's miserable. He's trapped. And the episode ends with Peter and the guys helping him find a way to get out of the marriage. Quagmire goes right back to being single. Right back to the old patterns. Right back to the cycle. A psychologist would look at this episode and see it as one of the clearest examples of what's really going on with Quagmire. It's not that he can't get a relationship. He literally got married. The opportunity for something real was right there in front of him. But the second it became real, the second it required him to actually open up and stay and be vulnerable with another person, he couldn't do it. He ran. And the reason he ran is because everything in his past, everything his family taught him, everything he experienced growing up, told him that staying was dangerous, that closeness leads to pain, that the only safe option is to keep things shallow, keep things short, and never let anyone get too close. And this pattern repeats itself again later in the series. In season 12, there's an episode called Quagmire's Quagmire, where Glenn meets a woman named Sonia. And Sonia is different from anyone else Quagmire has ever been with because she is basically the female version of him. She's aggressive. She's obsessive. She's overwhelming. She comes on incredibly strong. And at first, Quagmire is into it. Of course he is. She matches his energy. She's exactly the kind of person he thinks he wants. But very quickly, something shifts. Sonia doesn't just match Quagmire's energy. She exceeds it. She becomes controlling. She becomes possessive. She becomes someone that Quagmire can't get away from. And for the first time in the entire show, Quagmire gets to experience what it feels like to be on the other side. He gets to feel what it's like when someone pursues you with an intensity that crosses the line from flattering to frightening. He gets to feel what it's like when someone won't take no for an answer. He gets to feel what it's like when someone treats you not as a person with feelings, but as a thing they want to have. And it scares him. It genuinely, truly scares him. This episode is one of the very few times in the show where Quagmire is actually afraid. Not joking afraid, not comedy afraid, really afraid. And what makes this so important is that Sonia is basically showing Quagmire a mirror. She's showing him what his own behavior looks like from the other side. And he doesn't like what he sees. He doesn't like how it feels. He wants out. A psychologist would look at this episode and point out something really crucial. Quagmire's reaction to Sonia proves that, on some level, he knows his own behavior is wrong. He knows that the way he pursues women, the way he pushes past boundaries, the way he treats people as objects to be chased rather than humans to be respected, he knows it's not okay. Because the second someone does it to him, he can't handle it. He recognizes it as wrong immediately. But when he's the one doing it, he can't see it, or he won't see it. And that gap between knowing something is wrong and doing it anyway is one of the most common things a psychologist deals with. It's the gap between understanding and behavior. And closing that gap is one of the hardest things any person can do. But perhaps the most revealing thing about Quagmire and women isn't any of his short-term encounters or even his failed relationships. It's his long-running feelings for one specific person, Lois Griffin, Peter's wife. His best friend's wife. Throughout the entire run of Family Guy, the show has made it clear over and over again that Quagmire has real feelings for Lois. This isn't just a passing attraction or a one-time joke. It comes up repeatedly across multiple seasons. He stares at her, he makes comments about her. There are entire scenes and sometimes entire storylines built around the fact that Quagmire is drawn to Lois in a way that goes deeper than his usual behavior. And this is the part that a psychologist would find most interesting. Think about why Quagmire is attracted to Lois specifically. Out of every woman in Quahog, out of every woman he could possibly pursue, the one he keeps coming back to is the one he absolutely cannot have. She's married. She's married to his best friend. She has a family. She is the most unavailable woman in his entire world. And that's exactly why he wants her. This is a pattern that psychologists see all the time. People who are afraid of real closeness often find themselves drawn to people who are unavailable. And the reason is simple. If you want someone you can never have, you never have to face the scary part. You never have to actually be in a relationship with them. You never have to be vulnerable. You never have to risk getting hurt. You get to have all the feelings of wanting someone without any of the risk of actually being with them. It's the safest form of longing there is. And for Quagmire, who is terrified of real emotional closeness, wanting Lois is perfect, because it will never go anywhere. He gets to feel something without ever having to do anything about it. He gets to want without ever having to have. And that keeps him safe. But it also keeps him stuck. Because as long as Quagmire is hung up on a woman he can never be with, he has a built-in excuse to never seriously try with anyone else. Why would he commit to someone new when the woman he really wants is right next door? It's a trap, but it's a trap he built for himself, and it's one more way that his fear of closeness keeps him locked in the same cycle he's been in for years. So when you put it all together, Quagmire's relationship with women tells a very clear story. The endless chasing is not about desire. It's about avoiding pain. The failed marriage to Joan is not about him being unable to love. It's about him being too afraid to stay. The nightmare with Sonia is not just a funny episode. It's a mirror that shows him exactly who he is, and he can't face it. And his feelings for Lois are not romantic. They're a safety net, a way to want love without ever having to risk actually getting it. Any psychologist looking at this pattern would say the same thing. This is a man who desperately wants connection, but is completely terrified of it. And that combination, wanting something while being afraid of it at the same time, is one of the most painful things a person can experience. Because you're never at peace. You're always reaching for something while also pulling your hand back. You're always stuck between wanting more and being too scared to take it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that pain doesn't just affect his love life. It seeps into every part of who he is. It affects the way he sees himself, the way he carries himself, and most importantly, the way he treats the men he calls his closest friends. Because those friendships are just as complicated and just as revealing as anything we've talked about so far. Section 4. The Guys at the Clam. Quagmire's Friendships. At the end of the last section, we talked about how Quagmire's fear of real emotional closeness doesn't just show up in his relationships with women, it bleeds into everything. And one of the places where it shows up most clearly, even though most people never think about it this way, is in the way he handles his friendships. Because Quagmire does have friends. He has a group of men that he sits with almost every single day. He has people in his life that he's known for years. But when you actually look at how those friendships work, what role Quagmire plays in the group, and how he acts when those friendships are tested, you start to see the same patterns from his love life showing up all over again, just in a different form. So let's start with the obvious. Quagmire's main social circle is the group at the Drunken Clam. That's Peter Griffin, Joe Swanson, and for a large part of the show, Cleveland Brown. These four men sit at the same booth, drink beer, and talk about their lives on what seems like a daily basis. It's the center of their social world, and on the surface, it looks like a normal group of guy friends. They joke around, they go on adventures together, they get into trouble together, they argue sometimes and make up later. It looks like any group of buddies you might see in real life. But if you pay close attention to the way Quagmire operates inside this group, something interesting starts to stand out. Quagmire is part of the group, but he's also somehow separate from it. Peter is the leader. He's the one who comes up with the plans, who drives the adventures, who sets the tone for what the group does on any given day. Joe is the grounded one, the cop. The guy who often serves as the voice of reason, even though he gets dragged into things anyway. Cleveland, when he was around, was the calm and easygoing one, the peacekeeper who went along with whatever was happening without making too much of a fuss. And Quagmire fills a role that most people don't really think about. He's there, he participates, he shows up every day, but his contribution to the group is almost always surface level. Think about it. When the guys sit at the booth and talk, what does Quagmire usually bring to the conversation? Most of the time, it circles back to women, or to some story about something he did the night before, or to a comment that's designed to get a laugh. He rarely opens up about anything real. He rarely shares what's actually going on in his life in any kind of vulnerable or honest way. The other guys do this sometimes. Peter talks about his marriage with Lois, even when things are rough. Joe talks about his frustrations and his struggles. Cleveland used to talk about his feelings pretty openly, but Quagmire keeps things light. He keeps things on the surface. He gives the group the version of himself that's easy to be around. The funny guy, the wild one, the character. And the real Quagmire stays hidden. A psychologist would look at this and recognize it as exactly the same thing he does with women, just applied to friendships instead. With women, Quagmire keeps things shallow, so he never has to be vulnerable. With his friends, he does the same thing. He shows up, he's present, he sits in the booth, but he never really lets them in. He never really shows them who he is underneath the act. And the result is that Quagmire has friends, but he doesn't have the kind of deep, meaningful friendships where someone truly knows you. He has drinking buddies. He has people he hangs out with. But does anyone in that group actually know what's going on inside Glenn Quagmire's head? Based on what the show gives us, the answer is probably no. And then there's his relationship with Peter specifically, which is one of the most interesting dynamics in the whole show. Peter Griffin is, without question, Quagmire's closest friend. They've lived next door to each other for years. They spend more time together than almost any other two characters on the show. And Quagmire is incredibly loyal to Peter. He goes along with Peter's insane plans. He backs Peter up when things go sideways. He puts up with behavior from Peter that would make most people walk away permanently. And Peter gives Quagmire a lot to put up with. Peter is selfish. He's reckless. He drags his friends into dangerous, absurd situations constantly. He makes decisions without thinking about how they'll affect the people around him. He's done things to Quagmire specifically that most people would consider friendship ending, and yet Quagmire stays every single time. No matter what Peter does, Quagmire is back at the booth the next day, sitting in the same spot, acting like nothing happened. A psychologist would ask a very important question here. Why? Why does Quagmire put up with this? Why does he tolerate behavior from Peter that he would never accept from anyone else? And the answer ties right back into everything we've been talking about. Quagmire stays because the friendship with Peter is safe in the exact way that Quagmire needs it to be safe. Peter never asks Quagmire to open up. Peter never pushes him to talk about his feelings. Peter never tries to get past the surface and find out what's really going on inside his friend's head. Peter just wants someone to sit at the bar with, someone to go on adventures with, someone who will laugh at his jokes and help him with his schemes. And that's perfect for Quagmire, because it means he can have a best friend without ever having to actually be emotionally close to that person. He gets the comfort of having someone there without any of the risk that comes with real closeness. It's the same pattern from his love life, just wearing different clothes. With women, he chases the feeling of connection without ever committing to the real thing. With Peter, he has the appearance of a deep friendship without ever actually going deep. He has figured out how to be around people constantly while never truly letting anyone know him. And that is an incredibly lonely way to live, even if he's never alone. But if Quagmire's friendship with Peter shows us how he avoids vulnerability, there's another relationship in the show that reveals something even more interesting about his psychology. And that's his relationship with Brian Griffin. Quagmire hates Brian. This is one of the longest running and most consistent character dynamics in all of Family Guy. While most relationships on the show shift and change depending on the episode, Quagmire's dislike of Brian is rock solid. It doesn't waver. It doesn't soften. From the moment the show establishes this dynamic, Quagmire cannot stand Brian, and he makes no effort to hide it. The most famous moment of this comes in the Season 8 episode, Jerome is the New Black. In that episode, there's a scene where Brian asks Quagmire directly why he doesn't like him, and Quagmire doesn't hold back. He unloads on Brian in one of the most intense and honest speeches the show has ever given him. He tells Brian that he thinks he's a terrible person. He calls him out for acting like he's smarter and more cultured than everyone around him, when he's really not. He calls him out for treating women badly while pretending to be someone who respects them. He calls him out for being a bad friend to Peter, for mooching off the Griffin family, for constantly hitting on Lois. Quagmire lays out a long, detailed, brutal list of every single thing he can't stand about Brian. And when he's done, he just walks away. Now, this scene is one of the most popular Quagmire moments in the entire show. Fans love it, people quote it all the time. And on the surface, it seems like Quagmire is just being brutally honest about someone who deserves it. Brian does have a lot of the flaws Quagmire describes. He can be pretentious, he can be hypocritical, he can be a bad friend. So it seems like Quagmire is just calling it like he sees it. But a psychologist would look at this scene very differently. Because here's the thing that most people don't stop to think about. A lot of the things Quagmire accuses Brian of are things that Quagmire himself is guilty of. He calls Brian out for treating women badly. But Quagmire treats women badly too. Arguably, much worse than Brian ever has. He calls Brian out for hitting on Lois. But Quagmire has been attracted to Lois for the entire series. He calls Brian out for being a bad friend to Peter. But Quagmire has done plenty of things over the years that weren't exactly the actions of a perfect friend either. So why does Quagmire hate Brian so much, when they actually have a lot in common? A psychologist would say this is one of the clearest examples of something very common in human behavior. Sometimes the things that bother us most about other people are actually the things we don't want to face about ourselves. When Quagmire looks at Brian, he's not just seeing Brian's flaws, he's seeing a reflection of his own. Brian acts intellectual and superior to hide the fact that he's insecure. Quagmire acts like a carefree ladies' man to hide the fact that he's lonely and broken. Brian pretends to respect women while treating them poorly. Quagmire does the same thing in his own way. They are, in a lot of ways, two sides of the same coin, and Quagmire can't stand that. Because it's much easier to hate someone else for the things you do than it is to look in the mirror and admit you have a problem. It's much easier to point at Brian and say you're a bad person than it is to sit with yourself and ask, am I a bad person too? And that's exactly what Quagmire does. He takes all the self-awareness that he can't handle, all the uncomfortable truths about himself that he doesn't want to face, and he puts them on Brian. He makes Brian the bad guy so that he doesn't have to be the bad guy in his own story. And it works. It works so well that Quagmire probably doesn't even realize he's doing it. And the fact that he gets praised for it, both by other characters on the show and by fans watching at home, only makes it stronger. That speech in Jerome is the New Black is treated like a hero moment. Quagmire told Brian the truth. Quagmire put Brian in his place. But the deeper truth is that Quagmire described himself just as much as he described Brian. He just doesn't know it, or he won't admit it. This is one of the most important things a psychologist would point out about Quagmire's character. He has the ability to see flaws in other people with perfect clarity. He can look at Brian and list out every single thing wrong with him without hesitation. But he cannot turn that same lens on himself. He is completely blind to his own patterns, his own mistakes, his own damage. And that blindness is what keeps him stuck. Because you can't fix something you refuse to see. You can't change a pattern you won't acknowledge exists. And as long as Quagmire is focused on what's wrong with Brian, he never has to think about what's wrong with himself. So what does all of this add up to? Quagmire has a best friend in Peter who he never opens up to. He has a group of guys at the bar who he sees every day but never truly lets in. And he has a deep, burning hatred for Brian that is actually a reflection of everything he can't face about himself. These are not the friendships of a happy, well-adjusted person. These are the friendships of someone who has figured out how to be surrounded by people while remaining completely alone on the inside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that inside, that inner world of Glenn Quagmire is where a psychologist would want to look next. Because while his relationships with women and his friendships tell us a lot about his patterns, the real question is what Quagmire thinks about himself when no one else is around. And the show gives us more answers to that question than you might expect. Section 5. Behind Closed Doors, Quagmire's Inner World. At the end of the last section, we talked about how Quagmire has managed to build a life where he is constantly surrounded by people, but never truly known by any of them. He has drinking buddies, he has a best friend, he has an endless parade of women moving through his life, but none of them ever see the real Glenn Quagmire. None of them ever get past the act. And that raises a really important question. What is Quagmire actually like when the act drops? What goes on inside his head when the giggity stops and he's sitting in that house on Spooner Street by himself? Because the show does give us glimpses of that. Not often, not in every episode, but every now and then, Family Guy pulls back the curtain and shows us the version of Quagmire that nobody else gets to see. And what's behind that curtain is much sadder than most people realize. The first and maybe most important thing to understand about Quagmire's inner world is what gives him a sense of identity. Every person needs something that makes them feel like they matter. Something that gives their life structure and meaning. For Peter, that's his family. For Joe, that's his career as a police officer. For Cleveland, it was his easygoing place in the community. And for Quagmire, it's being a pilot. We talked earlier about how Quagmire works as a commercial airline pilot, and how that's actually a pretty impressive career. But it goes deeper than just having a good job. For Quagmire, being a pilot isn't just what he does, it's who he is. It's the one part of his life that he takes completely seriously. He doesn't joke about it, he doesn't treat it casually. When the show puts Quagmire in his pilot uniform, there's a shift in how he carries himself. He stands a little straighter, he talks a little differently, there's a pride there that you don't see in any other part of his life. Being a pilot is the one thing that Quagmire can point to and say, this is mine, this is real, this actually means something. And the episode that proves just how deeply this matters to him is Airport 07 from season 5. In that episode, Peter does something reckless, which is not unusual for Peter, but this time the consequences land directly on Quagmire. Peter's actions lead to Quagmire losing his pilot's license. His career, the one thing that gave him real purpose and real pride, is taken away from him. And Quagmire's reaction is unlike almost anything else we ever see from this character. He doesn't laugh it off, he doesn't make a joke, he doesn't shrug and move on like he does with everything else in his life. He is devastated, completely and utterly devastated. This is one of the most revealing moments in the entire series when it comes to understanding who Quagmire really is. Because it shows us that underneath everything, underneath the women and the jokes and the act, there is something that Quagmire genuinely cares about. Something that he has invested real emotion and real pride into. And when it gets taken away, he falls apart. He doesn't have some backup plan. He doesn't just move on to the next thing the way he moves on to the next woman after a short-term encounter. He's lost. Because without being a pilot, Quagmire doesn't know who he is. A psychologist would find this very significant. When a person builds their entire sense of self around one single thing, whether it's a job, a relationship, a talent, or anything else, it creates a very fragile foundation. As long as that one thing is there, the person feels okay. They feel like they have value. They feel like they matter. But the second it's gone, everything crumbles. There's nothing underneath to hold them up. And that's exactly what we see with Quagmire in that episode. Take away the pilot's license, and you take away the only thing that makes him feel like he's worth something. Everything else in his life, the women, the parties, the giggity persona, none of it gives him real self-worth. It's all just noise. The pilot career is the only signal. And that tells us something really important about how Quagmire sees himself. Deep down, underneath everything, Quagmire does not think very highly of Glenn Quagmire. The act, the bravado, the confidence with women, all of that is a performance. It's a mask. And behind that mask is a man who doesn't really believe he has much to offer the world beyond one job and one skill. Take that away, and there's nothing left. Just a guy in a Hawaiian shirt sitting in an empty house with no idea what his life is actually about. But the episode that might tell us the most about Quagmire's inner world isn't about his career at all. It's about something much more personal. In Season 8, there's an episode called Quagmire's Baby. In this episode, Quagmire discovers that he has a baby daughter. A baby girl named Anna Lee shows up on his doorstep, and it's revealed that she's his child. Now, given everything we know about Quagmire's lifestyle, the fact that he has a child out there somewhere isn't exactly shocking. But what happens next is, Quagmire decides to try to raise her. He doesn't run away. He doesn't make a joke out of it. He doesn't hand her off to someone else and go back to his normal life. He actually tries. He holds her, he feeds her, he attempts to figure out how to be a father. And for a few moments in that episode, you see something in Quagmire that the show almost never shows. You see hope. You see a man who is looking at this tiny baby and thinking, maybe this is it. maybe this is the thing that changes everything. Maybe this is the reason to finally be different. And that hope is what makes the rest of the episode so painful. Because Quagmire tries. He really, genuinely tries. But as the episode goes on, the reality of the situation becomes clear. Quagmire is not ready to be a father. His lifestyle, his habits, his patterns, all of the things that define his daily life, they're not compatible with raising a child. And more importantly, Quagmire himself starts to realize this. He looks at Anna Lee, and he looks at himself. And he understands, maybe for the first time in his life, that he is not the person this child needs him to be. So he gives her up. He finds a good family, a stable family, a family that can give Anna Lee the kind of life that Quagmire knows he can't provide. And he lets her go. This is, without any exaggeration, one of the most emotionally heavy moments in the entire history of Family Guy. Because it's not just sad, it's self-aware. Quagmire doesn't give Anna Lee up because he doesn't care. He gives her up because he does care. He cares enough to look at himself honestly, probably more honestly than he's ever looked at himself before, and admit that he's not good enough, that his life is too broken, that the way he lives, the patterns he can't break, the person he's become, all of it makes him unfit to be the father this little girl deserves. A psychologist would look at this moment and see two things happening at once. The first is a moment of incredible self-awareness. Quagmire sees himself clearly. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't pretend he can make it work. He faces the truth about who he is and makes the hardest decision a parent can make based on that truth. That takes a level of honesty that most people never reach, and it shows us that Quagmire is far more capable of deep thought and genuine feeling than his surface personality would ever suggest. But the second thing a psychologist would see is something much sadder. Because giving up Anna Lee also means that Quagmire has accepted, on some level, that he can't change. He's not saying, I'll get better and come back for her. He's not saying, give me a year to get my life together. He's saying, this is who I am, and who I am isn't good enough. He has looked at himself and decided that the patterns are permanent, that the damage is done, that the person his family and his experiences turned him into is the person he's always going to be. And rather than try to fight that, rather than try to grow and change and become someone different, he accepts it. He lets Anna Lee go because he believes he'll never be anything more than what he is right now. And that belief, that quiet, unspoken belief that he's not capable of being better, is maybe the saddest thing about Glenn Quagmire's entire character. Because it means that somewhere deep inside, he's given up on himself. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. Not in a way that anyone around him would notice. He still goes to the bar. He still flies planes. He still says giggity. On the outside, everything looks the same. But on the inside, there's a man who has looked at himself and decided that this is all he'll ever be. And once a person reaches that point, once they truly believe that change isn't possible for them, it becomes a kind of prison. Not because they literally can't change, but because they've decided they can't. And that decision stops them from ever trying. This is what makes Quagmire's inner world so different from his outer world. On the outside, he looks confident. He looks carefree. He looks like a guy who doesn't take anything seriously and is having the time of his life. But on the inside, there's a man who lost his sense of self when his pilot's license was threatened. A man who tried to be a father and decided he wasn't good enough. A man who has accepted his own broken patterns as permanent features of who he is, rather than things that could be worked on and healed. A psychologist would say that Quagmire is living in a state of quiet resignation. He's not actively suffering, at least not in a way that most people would recognize. He's not crying in his room every night or having breakdowns at the bar. It's more subtle than that. It's a low-level sadness that sits underneath everything he does. A feeling that this is as good as it gets. That the life he has right now, the shallow encounters, the surface-level friendships, the empty house he goes home to every night, that this is the ceiling. That there's no point in reaching for more, because more isn't available to someone like him. And the worst part is that this belief feeds the very patterns that created it. He believes he can't change, so he doesn't try to change. Because he doesn't try to change, the patterns continue.
Because the patterns continue, his belief that he can't change gets stronger. It's a circle, a loop. Each part reinforces the other. And unless something breaks that loop, unless something forces Quagmire to challenge the story he's been telling himself about who he is, it just keeps going. Round and round, year after year, episode after episode. The same booth at the Drunken Clam. The same empty house on Spooner Street. The same giggity hiding the same pain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that pain, as quiet as it is, doesn't stay contained. It leaks out. It shows up in moments that the average viewer might not think twice about, but that a psychologist would recognize immediately. Moments of sudden anger. Moments of unexpected cruelty. Moments where Quagmire does something so out of proportion to the situation that it makes you wonder what's really going on underneath. And those moments, those flashes of something darker, are exactly what we need to talk about next. Section 6, the dark side, when the pain comes out. At the end of the last section, we talked about how Quagmire's inner pain doesn't just stay inside. It leaks out. It shows up in moments that the average viewer might watch without thinking too deeply about, but that a psychologist would immediately recognize as signs of something much bigger going on beneath the surface. Because here's the truth about pain that people carry around without dealing with it. It doesn't just sit there quietly. It doesn't stay in its corner forever. When a person pushes down enough hurt for long enough, it finds a way out. And it usually comes out in ways that seem sudden, extreme, or completely out of proportion to whatever triggered it. And with Quagmire, the show gives us plenty of those moments. Moments where the mask slips. Moments where the easygoing, joke-cracking, giggity version of Quagmire disappears, and something much harder, much angrier, and much darker takes its place. The most obvious place to start is with something we touched on earlier but didn't fully explore from this angle. The situation with his sister Brenda and her abusive boyfriend Jeff Fiekelman. We talked in the family section about how this storyline showed us a different side of Quagmire, a protective brother who was terrified for his sister. And that's true. But there's another layer to what happens in that episode, Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q from season 10, that tells us something very important about how Quagmire handles situations when his back is against the wall. Throughout that episode, Quagmire tries everything he can think of to get Brenda away from Jeff. He talks to her, he begs her, he tries to make her see what's happening, he goes to the authorities. He does what most people would consider the right thing. He follows the rules. He tries to handle it the way society says you're supposed to handle it. And none of it works. Brenda stays with Jeff. The system doesn't protect her. Nothing changes. And Quagmire watches his sister continue to be hurt by this man while feeling completely powerless to stop it. And then, at the end of the episode, Quagmire makes a choice. He, along with Peter and Joe, takes matters into his own hands. They kill Jeff Fiekelman. They end the threat to Brenda permanently, outside the law, outside the system, outside anything that would be considered acceptable behavior in the real world. It's one of the most shocking moments in Family Guy history. This is a comedy show. Characters don't usually face real consequences, and the heroes don't usually cross lines this extreme. But Quagmire does. Without hesitation. When he decides that there is no other way to protect someone he loves, he is willing to go further than almost any other character on the show would go. Now, a psychologist would look at this and see something very important happening. This isn't just a man protecting his sister. This is a man who has been carrying anger inside him for his entire life, finally letting it out. Think about everything Quagmire has been through. A mother who used sex to solve problems. A father whose transition shook his world. A lifetime of failed relationships. A career that was almost taken from him. A daughter he had to give away because he didn't think he was good enough. All of that pain, all of that frustration, all of that anger at the world for making him who he is, anger that he's never once expressed openly or dealt with in any healthy way. It's been sitting inside him for years, building pressure, waiting for somewhere to go. And when Jeff Fiekelman threatened the one person Quagmire truly loves without any complicated feelings attached, when his sister was in danger and nothing else was working,
All of that stored-up rage found its exit. This is something psychologists see regularly. People who suppress their emotions for long periods of time don't just stay calm forever. The pressure builds. And when it finally breaks through, the reaction is almost always bigger than the situation alone would call for. That doesn't mean what Quagmire did wasn't understandable. Jeff was a dangerous person who was hurting Brenda, but the speed and certainty with which Quagmire moved to that extreme solution, the lack of hesitation, the willingness to cross a line that most people would never cross, that tells you this wasn't just about Jeff. This was years of bottled-up pain finally finding a target. Jeff was the trigger, but the ammunition had been loading for decades. And the Jeff situation isn't the only time we see Quagmire's darker side emerge. Throughout the run of the show, there are moments where Quagmire displays a temper and a capacity for aggression that doesn't match his usual laid-back, joke-cracking persona. He can go from calm to furious in a way that seems almost instant. One second, he's the easygoing guy at the bar, and the next, he's in someone's face with a level of intensity that genuinely feels dangerous. And these moments almost always happen when something hits a nerve. When something pokes at one of the wounds he's been trying to keep covered. A psychologist would call these moments emotional flooding. When a person has a lot of unprocessed pain stored up inside them, certain situations can trigger a response that goes way beyond what the moment actually requires. It's like poking a bruise. If you poke normal skin, it doesn't hurt much. But if you poke a bruise, the pain is sharp and sudden and way out of proportion to how hard you actually pressed. Quagmire's emotional bruises are massive. His childhood, his family, his loneliness, his failed relationships, his belief that he can't change. All of these are bruises. And when something in his daily life accidentally presses on one of them, the reaction is immediate and intense. And here's what makes this even more interesting from a psychological point of view. Quagmire almost never directs that anger where it actually belongs. He doesn't get angry at his mother for teaching him that sex was a transaction. He doesn't get angry at his father for the upheaval in his family. He doesn't get angry at himself for the patterns he can't break. Instead, the anger comes out sideways. It lands on whoever happens to be in front of him at the moment. Brian gets the full force of it in that speech we talked about in the last section. Jeff Fiekelman gets the most extreme version of it. Random people who cross Quagmire at the wrong moment get flashes of it. But the real sources of his pain, the real things he's angry about, those never get addressed. The anger just bounces around, hitting whatever target is closest, while the actual wound stays open and untreated. This is one of the most frustrating things a psychologist would see in Quagmire's character, because he clearly has the ability to feel deeply. The situation with Brenda proved that. He clearly has the ability to see problems in other people. His takedown of Brian proved that. He clearly has moments of real self-awareness. Giving up Anna Lee proved that. All of the pieces are there. The emotional depth, the intelligence, the capacity for honest self-reflection. Quagmire has everything he would need to actually face his pain and start dealing with it. But he never puts those pieces together. He uses his emotional depth to care about Brenda, but not to examine why his own life is such a mess. He uses his ability to see flaws in others to tear apart Brian, but never to look at himself. He uses his self-awareness to give up his daughter, but not to ask the harder question of whether he could actually become a better person if he tried. It's like having all the tools to build a house, but only ever using them to build walls. Quagmire has every tool he needs to understand himself and to change. But instead of using those tools to open doors and let light in, he uses them to keep everything locked up even tighter. And the darker moments, the explosions of anger, the willingness to go to extremes, those are what happen when you keep things locked up for too long. The pressure has to go somewhere, and when it does, it's never clean and it's never controlled. There's also something important to talk about when it comes to the way the show treats Quagmire's darker behavior versus how it treats the darker behavior of other characters. Because Family Guy is, at its core, a comedy, every character does terrible things sometimes. Peter has done awful things to his family and friends. Brian has done selfish, hurtful things. Stewie has done things that are objectively much worse than anything Quagmire has ever done. And in almost every case, the show treats these moments as jokes. They happen, the episode ends, and everyone resets back to normal the next week. That's how animated comedies work. But with Quagmire, there's a difference. When Quagmire does something dark, the show sometimes lingers on it in a way that it doesn't with other characters. The Brenda episode wasn't played for laughs.
The Anna Lee episode wasn't played for laughs.
Even his speech to Brian, while fans found it satisfying, wasn't really structured as a joke. It was structured as a genuine emotional release. The show treats Quagmire's darkness with a weight that it doesn't always give to other characters, and that tells us something about how the writers see him. They know there's something real underneath. They know that when Quagmire goes dark, it's not just a gag. It's a window into something genuine and something painful. A psychologist would also point out something else about Quagmire's dark moments. They almost always involve a very specific theme: control. When Quagmire feels out of control, that's when the worst comes out. When he can't control the situation with Brenda and Jeff, he resorts to the most extreme form of control possible. When he can't control how he feels about Brian, he unleashes a verbal attack designed to tear Brian down completely. When his pilot's license was threatened and he couldn't control his own career, he fell apart. The common thread in all of Quagmire's darkest moments is a feeling of powerlessness that he cannot tolerate, and that connects back to everything in his past. When you grow up in a household like Quagmire's, you have no control. You can't control your mother's behavior. You can't control your father's choices. You can't control what happens to your sister. You're a child, and children are powerless. They watch things happen around them, and they can't do anything about it. And that feeling of powerlessness, that feeling of being at the mercy of forces you can't influence, it plants a seed that grows into an adult who cannot stand to feel that way ever again. An adult who needs to feel in control at all times. And when that control is threatened, when something happens that makes them feel like that helpless child again, the reaction is massive. It's disproportionate. It's dark. Because it's not really about what's happening right now. It's about all the times in the past when they couldn't do anything, all coming back at once. This is the engine that drives Quagmire's darkest behavior. A childhood of powerlessness created an adult who responds to helplessness with extreme force. Whether that force is emotional, like the Brian speech, or physical, like the situation with Jeff, the root cause is the same. Quagmire cannot be powerless. He won't be powerless. And when life puts him in a position where he feels that way, whatever comes out is going to be intense. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So now we've seen the full picture of who Quagmire is beneath the surface. We've seen his family and where the damage started. We've seen how it plays out in his relationships with women. We've seen how it shapes his friendships. We've seen how he views himself when nobody is watching. And we've seen what happens when the pain builds up too much and breaks through. But there's still one more piece of this puzzle that a psychologist would want to examine, and it might be the most important one of all. Because despite all of this damage, despite all of these patterns, there are moments scattered throughout the show where Quagmire does something that surprises everyone, including himself. Moments where he shows genuine kindness, real sacrifice, and actual growth. And those moments raise a question that changes everything about how we understand this character. Section 7. Glimmers of Light. The Good in Glenn Quagmire. At the end of the last section, we raised a question that changes how we look at this entire character. We've spent a lot of time talking about Quagmire's damage, his broken family, his unhealthy patterns with women, his surface-level friendships, his quiet belief that he's not capable of being better, his explosions of anger when the pain gets to be too much. And all of that is real. All of that is there in the show, backed up by episode after episode of evidence. But if that was all there was to Quagmire, if he was nothing but damage and darkness and broken patterns, then there really wouldn't be much to analyze. He'd just be a sad case, a lost cause, a character who was broken from the start and stayed that way. But that's not the full picture, because scattered throughout Family Guy, often in the episodes you'd least expect, there are moments where Glenn Quagmire does something genuinely good. Not good in a selfish way. Not good because he's trying to get something out of it. Genuinely, purely, selflessly good. Moments where he puts someone else's needs ahead of his own. Moments where he shows a kind of emotional strength that most people wouldn't think he was capable of. And these moments matter more than almost anything else in understanding who Quagmire really is. Because they tell us that the damage didn't destroy him. Not completely. There is still a good person inside Glenn Quagmire. That person just doesn't get to come out very often. Let's start with the one we've already talked about, but need to look at from a different angle. Anna Lee.
In Section 5, we talked about how Quagmire giving up his daughter was a moment of painful self-awareness. And it was. But there's another way to look at that same decision, and it's the one a psychologist would want to make sure we didn't miss. Because giving up Anna Lee wasn't just an act of self-awareness. It was an act of love. Real, unconditional, selfless love. The kind of love that puts someone else's well-being above your own feelings. Think about what Quagmire actually did in that moment. He had a daughter, a baby girl who was his own flesh and blood. The one chance he might ever get to have a family of his own, to be part of something real and lasting, to have someone in his life who would love him no matter what. Every lonely night in that empty house on Spooner Street, every failed relationship, every time he watched Peter go home to Lois and the kids while he went home to nobody. All of that could have ended right there. Anna Lee could have been his reason, his purpose, the thing that finally filled the hole inside him. And he gave her up. Not because he didn't want her, not because he didn't love her, but because he loved her enough to know that what she needed mattered more than what he wanted. He looked at this tiny baby and made the hardest calculation a parent can make. He weighed his own desire to keep her against her need for a stable home, and he chose her. He put her first. He sacrificed the one thing that might have made him happy because keeping it would have come at her expense. A psychologist would point out that this is not the behavior of a person who is completely broken. A truly selfish person, a person with no capacity for real love, would have kept Anna Lee regardless of whether he could give her a good life. He would have held on because it made him feel good, because it filled a void, because it gave him something he wanted. But Quagmire didn't do that. He did the opposite. And the fact that he was capable of that level of selflessness, even once, even in just one episode, tells us something incredibly important. The capacity for good is still in there. The ability to love someone more than he loves himself is still in there. It's buried under years and years of damage, but it's not gone. And Anna Lee isn't the only evidence. Let's look at how Quagmire behaves when the people he cares about are in real trouble. Not everyday trouble, not sitcom-level problems. Real, serious, someone could get hurt trouble. Because in those moments, a very different version of Quagmire shows up. We already talked about what he did for Brenda, but think about the larger pattern. When Brenda was being abused by Jeff, Quagmire didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the pros and cons. He didn't think about himself at all. Every single thing he did in that episode was about getting his sister to safety. He tried the legal route first. He went to Peter, Joe, and the authorities. He exhausted every reasonable option, and when none of them worked, he went further. You can debate whether what happened at the end of that episode was right or wrong, but what you cannot debate is why he did it. He did it out of pure love for his sister. There was no other motive, no hidden agenda, no benefit to himself. He put himself at enormous risk because someone he loved was suffering, and he couldn't stand by and watch it continue. That's not the action of a broken man. That's the action of a man with a deep, powerful capacity for love that he almost never gets to express. And the reason he almost never gets to express it is because his daily life is structured in a way that doesn't allow for it. He fills his time with shallow encounters and surface-level relationships, specifically to avoid the kind of deep connection that would bring this side of him out. But when life forces him into a situation where someone he truly cares about needs him, the walls come down and the real Quagmire appears. And that Quagmire is brave. He's fierce. He's willing to sacrifice everything. He's the person that Glenn Quagmire could be all the time if his damage would let him. And here's something else that most fans don't think about. Quagmire's career as a pilot isn't just a source of identity for him. It's also evidence of something genuinely admirable about his character. Being a commercial airline pilot is a serious job. Every time Quagmire climbs into that cockpit, he is responsible for the lives of hundreds of people. That's not a job you can do if you're careless. That's not a job you can do if you don't take anything seriously. That's a job that requires focus, discipline, training, and a genuine sense of responsibility for other human beings. And Quagmire does it well. The show never presents him as a bad pilot. He's good at his job. He takes it seriously. In an Airport 2007, when his license is threatened, we see just how much it means to him. Not just because of the identity it gives him, but because flying is something he's worked hard for and something he takes genuine pride in being good at. A psychologist would say that Quagmire's dedication to his career is proof that he is capable of sustained commitment, discipline, and responsibility when the context is right. He's not someone who is fundamentally incapable of being serious or reliable. He's someone who channels those abilities into a very specific area of his life while letting everything else fall apart. And that's an important difference. Because it means the skills are there. The ability to commit, to show up, to take responsibility, to care about something bigger than himself. All of that exists inside Quagmire. It's just locked away in one compartment while the rest of his life runs on autopilot. And then there's his loyalty to his friends, which we touched on in the friendship section, but need to revisit here from a positive angle. Because yes, Quagmire's friendships are surface level in many ways. Yes, he never truly opens up. Yes, he uses humor and deflection to avoid vulnerability. All of that is true. But there's another truth sitting right next to it. Quagmire shows up every single day, without fail. He's at the clam, he's in the booth, he's there for Peter and Joe and whoever else needs him. And when his friends are in trouble, when the chips are actually down, Quagmire doesn't disappear. He doesn't make excuses. He's there. Think about how many of Peter's insane adventures Quagmire has gone along with. Think about how many times he's been dragged into situations that had nothing to do with him and could have easily hurt him, and he went anyway. Not because he had to, because Peter asked, because his friend needed him. Quagmire could say no at any point. He could stay home. He could decide that whatever stupid plan Peter has cooked up this week isn't worth the risk. But he doesn't. He shows up. He always shows up. That consistency matters more than most people realize. In psychology, one of the most telling things about a person isn't what they say or even what they feel, it's what they do. Actions over time reveal character more than any single moment can. And Quagmire's actions over time show a man who is deeply loyal to the people in his life, even when those people don't always deserve it, even when the loyalty isn't returned equally, and even when it costs him something. He may not open up to his friends emotionally. He may not share what's going on inside his head. But he is there for them, physically, reliably, consistently there. And for someone who is supposedly afraid of commitment and closeness, that tells you something. He's already committed to these people. He just doesn't know how to take the next step and let them in. A psychologist looking at all of these moments together, Anna Lee, Brenda, his career, his loyalty to his friends, would come to a very specific conclusion. Quagmire is not a bad person. He's not even a mediocre person who occasionally does something good. He's a good person who is trapped inside patterns that were forced on him by a broken upbringing and decades of avoiding his own pain. The good moments aren't the exceptions, they're the truth. The selfish moments, the shallow behavior, the giggity act, those are the exceptions. Those are the walls he built to protect himself. And every now and then, the real person behind those walls manages to break through. And what makes that so heartbreaking is that Quagmire himself probably doesn't see it that way. Remember what we talked about in Section 5. Quagmire has accepted that he can't change. He's decided that the person he is today, the broken patterns, the shallow relationships, the empty house, that this is the ceiling. This is all he'll ever be. When he gave up Anna Lee, he wasn't just saying, she deserves better than what I can give her right now. He was saying, she deserves better than what I'll ever be able to give her. He doesn't see the good in himself as evidence that he could be more. He sees it as a painful reminder of the gap between who he is and who he wishes he could be. And that gap is the core of Quagmire's tragedy. Because the person he wishes he could be, the good father, the loyal brother, the dedicated professional, the reliable friend, he already is that person. He just can't see it. The damage has convinced him that the dark moments are who he really is, and the good moments are just flukes. But a psychologist would say it's the opposite. The good moments are the real Quagmire. The dark moments are what happens when the real Quagmire gets buried under too much pain. If Quagmire could somehow see himself the way we see him in these moments, if he could understand that the man who gave up Anna Lee out of love, and the man who protected Brenda at any cost, and the man who shows up for his friends every single day is the real him, not the giggity act, everything could change. The patterns could break, the walls could come down, the empty house could stop being empty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But seeing yourself clearly is the hardest thing any person can do, especially when you've spent a lifetime building walls specifically designed to keep yourself from looking too closely. And that brings us to maybe the most important question in this entire analysis. After everything we've looked at, after all the damage and the pain and the patterns and the moments of light, the question a psychologist would ultimately want to answer is this: can Quagmire actually change? Is there a path forward for this character, or is he truly stuck? And the answer to that question is more complicated than you might think. Section 8. Can Quagmire change? The psychologist's verdict. At the end of the last section, we asked what might be the most important question in this entire video. After everything we've looked at, after the broken family, the unhealthy patterns with women, the surface-level friendships, the quiet resignation, the dark moments, and the genuine flashes of goodness, the big question is this: can Glenn Quagmire actually change? Is there a version of this character's story where he breaks free from his patterns and becomes the person that those good moments suggest he could be? Or is he truly stuck? Is the damage too deep? Are the patterns too strong? Has too much time passed? A psychologist would have a lot to say about this, and the answer isn't simple. It's not a clean yes or no. It's complicated, because the evidence the show gives us pulls in both directions. There are real, concrete reasons to believe Quagmire could change, and there are equally real, equally concrete reasons to believe he never will. And understanding both sides is essential to understanding this character fully. So let's start with the reasons for hope, because there are more of them than most people would expect. The first and most important reason a psychologist would point to is the fact that Quagmire has already changed in small ways throughout the run of the show. Not in huge, dramatic, life-altering ways, not in ways that stick permanently, but in ways that prove the machinery for change is still working inside him. He hasn't completely shut down. He hasn't become totally rigid. There is still movement in there, even if it's slow, and even if it usually gets pulled back. Look at the Annalise situation again. When Quagmire first found out he had a daughter, his initial reaction could have been to run. That would have been the easy move. That would have been completely consistent with his pattern of avoiding anything that requires real commitment. But he didn't run. He tried. He held that baby, and he attempted to figure out how to be a father. Now, he ultimately decided he couldn't do it and gave her up. But the fact that he tried at all, the fact that his first instinct was to step up rather than step away, that's significant. That's not the behavior of someone who is completely locked into their patterns. That's the behavior of someone who wants to be different, even if they can't quite get there yet. A psychologist would say that wanting to change is the single most important ingredient in actually changing. You can have all the tools and all the support in the world, but if a person doesn't want to be different, nothing happens. And Quagmire does want to be different. He may not say it out loud, he may not even fully admit it to himself, but his actions betray him. When he tried to raise Annalise, he was telling the world, and himself, that he wanted more than what he had. When he fought to protect Brenda, he was showing that he was capable of putting love above self-interest. When he takes pride in being a pilot, he's demonstrating that he knows what it feels like to commit to something and be good at it. The desire for something better is alive inside Quagmire. It hasn't been killed, it's just been buried. The second reason for hope is something we've already discussed, but that's worth coming back to in this context. Quagmire is capable of genuine self-awareness. This is rare. Most people who are stuck in destructive patterns can't see them at all. They go through life repeating the same mistakes, and they have no idea they're doing it. They blame other people. They blame circumstances. They blame bad luck. They never look inward. But Quagmire has looked inward. Maybe not often enough, and maybe not deeply enough, but he has done it. The Annalise decision is the clearest proof. He looked at himself honestly and said, "I am not what this child needs." That takes a level of self-knowledge that most people never achieve. Now, a psychologist would quickly point out that self-awareness alone isn't enough. Knowing you have a problem and fixing that problem are two very different things. There are plenty of people who can describe their own destructive patterns in perfect detail and still repeat them the very next day. Awareness is the first step, not the last step. But it is the first step, and Quagmire has taken it. That matters. The third reason for hope is his emotional depth. Throughout this video, we've seen over and over again that Quagmire is capable of feeling things deeply. His love for Brenda, his pain over Anna Lee, his devastation when his pilot's license was threatened, his genuine anger at Brian. Even his attraction to Lois, as complicated as it is, shows a capacity for deep, lasting feeling. Quagmire is not emotionally flat. He is not numb inside. The feelings are there. They're powerful. They're real.
He just doesn't know what to do with them. He doesn't know how to express them in healthy ways. He doesn't know how to let them out without either burying them or exploding. But the raw material is there. A psychologist would say that emotional depth is actually an advantage when it comes to change. People who feel deeply have more to work with. They have more motivation. They have more fuel. The challenge isn't creating feelings that don't exist. The challenge is redirecting feelings that are already there into healthier channels. So those are the reasons for hope: the desire to change, the capacity for self-awareness, the emotional depth. All three are present in Quagmire's character. All three are ingredients that a psychologist would need to see before believing that change was possible, and all three are there. But now let's talk about the other side, because the reasons to believe Quagmire might never change are just as strong, and ignoring them would be dishonest. The first and biggest obstacle is time. Quagmire has been living inside these patterns for his entire adult life. His way of relating to women, his way of handling friendships, his way of dealing with pain, none of this is new. These aren't habits he picked up last year. These are behaviors that have been reinforced day after day, year after year, for decades. And the longer a pattern has been in place, the harder it is to break. It's the difference between trying to change direction in a car that's barely moving and trying to change direction in a car that's going 100 miles an hour. The speed, the momentum, the force behind these patterns is enormous, and overcoming that kind of momentum requires sustained effort over a long period of time. It's not something that happens in a single episode or a single moment of clarity. It's a long, slow, difficult process that most people give up on before they see results. The second obstacle is Quagmire's environment, and this is a big one. One of the most important things psychologists know about changing behavior is that your environment matters just as much as your internal motivation. You can want to change with every fiber of your being, but if you're surrounded by the same people, in the same places, doing the same things every single day, the pull of the old patterns is incredibly strong. And Quagmire's environment hasn't changed at all. He still lives on Spooner Street. He still goes to the Drunken Clam every day. He still sits in the same booth with the same people. He still flies his planes and comes home to the same empty house. Nothing about his external world has shifted. And as long as everything around him stays the same, it's going to be extremely difficult for anything inside him to change permanently. Think about it this way. Every day, Quagmire wakes up in the same house where he's lived for years. He walks into the same bar where he's been drinking for years. He sees the same friends who have always known him as the giggity guy. And those friends, as much as they care about him, don't push him to be different. Peter doesn't ask Quagmire about his feelings. Joe doesn't challenge him to examine his patterns. Nobody in Quagmire's daily life is holding up a mirror and saying, "You could be more than this." They like Quagmire the way he is. He's fun. He's entertaining. He fills a role in the group. And people who are comfortable with who you are right now, even if who you are right now isn't healthy, can actually make it harder to change. Not because they're bad friends, but because the comfort of staying the same is more powerful than the discomfort of trying to be different. The third obstacle is the one we talked about in section 5, and it might be the most powerful one of all: Quagmire's belief that he can't change. A psychologist would say that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are have an enormous impact on what we're actually capable of. If you believe you can grow, you're far more likely to grow. If you believe you're stuck, you're far more likely to stay stuck. Not because the belief literally controls reality, but because it controls effort. A person who believes they can change will try, and keep trying, even when it's hard. A person who believes they can't change will either never try at all, or they'll try once, hit a setback, and say, "See, I knew it, I can't do this," and then they stop.
And Quagmire's internal story about himself is deeply negative. He doesn't think he's capable of being a good father. He proved that when he gave up Anna Lee. He doesn't think he's capable of maintaining a real relationship. He proved that when he panicked during his marriage to Joan and couldn't get out fast enough. He doesn't think he's worthy of real love or real connection. He proved that every time he chose a shallow encounter over the possibility of something meaningful. These beliefs aren't just opinions he holds. They're the foundation of how he moves through the world. And changing a foundation is the hardest kind of change there is. You can repaint the walls, you can rearrange the furniture, but changing the foundation means tearing everything down and starting from scratch. And that is terrifying for any person, let alone someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding exactly that kind of deep, uncomfortable work. So what would a psychologist's final verdict be? Can Quagmire change? The honest answer, the answer that respects both the evidence for hope and the evidence for doubt, is this. Yes, Quagmire could change. The potential is there. The desire is there. The emotional depth is there. The self-awareness, limited as it is there. Nothing about his situation is truly hopeless. People with backgrounds just as broken as his, with patterns just as deep and just as old, have changed. It happens. It's real. It's possible. But it would be the hardest thing Quagmire has ever done. Harder than giving up Anna Lee. Harder than what happened with Jeff. Harder than anything the show has ever put him through. Because it wouldn't be about a single brave moment or a single painful decision. It would be about showing up every single day and choosing to be different. Choosing to sit with the pain instead of running from it. Choosing to be honest with Peter and Joe instead of hiding behind jokes. Choosing to walk away from shallow encounters even when the loneliness is screaming at him to find someone, anyone, to make it stop for a few hours. It would require him to face everything he's been avoiding since childhood. His mother's influence, his father's story, his sister's pain, the daughter he let go, the emptiness he fills with noise. All of it. And the hardest part? He would have to do it without any guarantee that it would work. That's the thing about real change. There's no promise at the end. You don't get a guarantee that if you do all the work, if you face all the pain, if you tear down all the walls, that everything will be okay on the other side. You do it on faith. You do it because the alternative, staying exactly where you are forever, is worse than the risk of trying. And for someone like Quagmire, who has spent his entire life minimizing risk in every area except the ones that don't matter, that leap of faith might be the one thing he can never quite bring himself to take. So can he change? Yes. Will he change? That's a different question entirely. And the answer to that question depends on something that a psychologist can identify but can never control. It depends on whether Glenn Quagmire, on some quiet night in that empty house on Spooner Street, finally decides that the pain of staying the same is greater than the fear of becoming someone new. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But whether Quagmire changes or not, there's one more thing we need to talk about. Because this analysis wouldn't be complete without looking at what Quagmire's story actually means. Not just for him as a character, but for the people watching. For the fans who've been laughing at Giggity for 20 years without ever thinking about what's underneath it. Because the real lesson of Quagmire's psychology isn't just about one animated man on one animated show. It's about something much bigger than that. Section 9. What Quagmire teaches us. The bigger picture. At the end of the last section, we said that the real lesson of Quagmire's psychology isn't just about one animated character on one animated show. It's about something bigger. And that's what this section is about. Because after spending all this time breaking down who Glenn Quagmire is, where his damage came from, how it shows up in his daily life, and whether or not he's capable of change, the natural question is, why does any of this matter? He's a cartoon character. He's not real. Nobody is actually sitting in a therapist's office working through the things we've been talking about. So why should anyone care about what a psychologist would say about a fictional man in a Hawaiian shirt who says giggity? The answer is simpler than you might think. We care because we recognize him. Not the catchphrase, not the over-the-top behavior, not the jokes. We recognize the patterns underneath all of that. And we recognize them because those patterns are everywhere, not just on television, in real life, in the people around us,
And if we're being honest, sometimes in ourselves. Think about the core of what we've been describing throughout this entire video. A person who uses humor to hide pain. A person who keeps relationships shallow because deep ones are scary. A person who is surrounded by people every day but still feels completely alone on the inside. A person who has convinced themselves that this is just who they are and that change isn't possible. A person who has all the tools they need to build a better life but can't bring themselves to use them because the fear of failure is stronger than the desire for something more. That's not just Quagmire. That's millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions. The details are different. Most people aren't airline pilots who live on a fictional street in Rhode Island. Most people don't have Quagmire's specific family history or his specific set of experiences. But the underlying patterns, the fear of closeness, the surface level connections, the quiet belief that you're not capable of more, those are some of the most common struggles that human beings face. And the reason Quagmire works as a character, the reason people have connected with him for over 20 years, even if they couldn't explain why, is because on some level, they see something familiar in him. Family Guy is a comedy. It's designed to make people laugh. And it does. Quagmire is funny. The giggity is funny. The absurd situations he gets into are funny. Nobody is arguing otherwise. But comedy has always had the ability to hide serious things inside funny packaging. That's one of the things that makes it so powerful. You can say something through a joke that you could never say with a straight face. You can explore something painful through a character who makes people laugh that you could never explore through a character who makes people cry. And Family Guy, whether the writers always intended it or not, has done exactly that with Quagmire. They created a character who makes people laugh on the surface while quietly carrying one of the most detailed and psychologically accurate portraits of emotional damage on the entire show. And the reason that matters is because it gives people a way to see these patterns without feeling threatened by them. When you watch Quagmire push away every chance at a real relationship, you might not consciously think about the times you've done something similar. When you watch him hide behind jokes at the clam instead of opening up to his friends, you might not consciously connect it to the times you've deflected a serious conversation with humor. When you watch him convince himself that he can't change, you might not consciously recognize the same voice inside your own head that says the same thing. But somewhere in the back of your mind, the connection is there. And sometimes that's how the most important realizations start. Not with some big dramatic moment, but with a quiet recognition while you're watching a cartoon at 2 in the morning. A psychologist would actually have a lot to say about why fictional characters can help people understand real psychological patterns. One of the hardest things about self-reflection is that it requires looking directly at yourself, and most people find that incredibly uncomfortable. It's much easier to look at someone else. It's much easier to analyze a character on a screen than it is to analyze the person in the mirror. But the interesting thing is that the insights you gain from looking at a fictional character can transfer directly to your own life. You watch Quagmire avoid vulnerability and you think, that's sad. He could have so much more if he just let people in. And then, maybe not right away, maybe not even consciously, you start to wonder if the same thing is true for you. That's the power of what Family Guy has built with this character. Whether they meant to or not, they've created a case study that anyone can learn from. And the lessons are real, even if the character isn't. So what are those lessons? What does Quagmire's story actually teach us when we look at it through a psychologist's eyes? The first lesson is that your childhood matters more than you think. This is something psychologists have been saying for a long time, and Quagmire's story illustrates it perfectly. The person he became as an adult didn't come from nowhere. It came directly from the household he grew up in. His mother's behavior taught him what relationships meant. His father's journey destabilized his sense of who his family was. His sister's suffering showed him what happens when love goes wrong. None of these things were his fault. He was a child. He didn't choose any of it, but it shaped him anyway. And the same is true for every single person watching this video. The things that happened to you when you were young, the way your family operated, the lessons you absorbed without even knowing you were absorbing them, all of that is still affecting you right now. Not because you're weak, not because you haven't quote-unquote gotten over it, but because that's simply how human beings work. Early experiences create patterns, and those patterns don't just go away on their own. They persist until they're actively examined and actively worked through. The second lesson is that the face people show the world is almost never the full story. Quagmire looks confident.
He looks carefree. He looks like a guy who doesn't have a worry in the world. And if you only ever see the surface, that's what you'd believe. But underneath that surface is loneliness, pain, fear, and a deep sense of inadequacy.
And if that's true for a cartoon character, imagine how much more true it is for the real people in your life. The friend who always cracks jokes might be the one who's hurting the most.
The person who seems like they have it all together might be falling apart when nobody's watching. The one who acts like nothing bothers them might be carrying more weight than anyone realizes.
Quagmire teaches us that you cannot judge a person's inner world by their outer performance. And that lesson, if you actually take it to heart, can change the way you treat every single person you interact with. The third lesson is about the cost of avoidance. Quagmire has spent his entire life avoiding pain, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding deep connections, avoiding honest conversations about how he feels. And where has it gotten him? Right back where he started. Alone. Stuck. Repeating the same patterns. Running on the same wheel. The avoidance didn't protect him. It imprisoned him. And the same thing happens in real life. When you avoid dealing with something painful, it doesn't go away. It follows you. It shapes your decisions without you realizing it. It pushes you into patterns that feel safe, but are actually just a different kind of trap. The short-term relief of not having to face something difficult always comes with a long-term cost. And that cost compounds over time. The longer you avoid, the harder it gets to face. The harder it gets to face, the more you avoid. And the cycle continues until something forces you to break it, or until you decide to break it yourself. The fourth lesson is maybe the most important one. It's the lesson about the gap between knowing and doing. Quagmire knows things about himself. He knows he's not ready to be a father. He knows that Brian's flaws mirror his own, even if he won't admit it. He knows that his life could be more than what it is. The knowledge is there. But knowledge alone has never been enough to change anyone. The gap between understanding your problem and actually fixing it is the hardest gap any human being ever has to cross. And most people never cross it. They sit on the knowing side forever, fully aware of what's wrong, but unable or unwilling to take the steps necessary to make it right. Quagmire is a perfect example of this. He's not unaware. He's not oblivious. He can see the problems. He just can't bridge the distance between seeing them and solving them. And if you're watching this video and you recognize that gap in your own life, if there's something you know you need to change, but you haven't been able to make yourself do it, then Quagmire's story is a mirror, not a judgment, not a criticism. A mirror. It's showing you what happens when that gap never gets closed. It's showing you what a life looks like when someone stays on the knowing side forever. And maybe, just maybe, seeing that reflected in a fictional character will give you the push that looking at yourself directly never could. Because here's the thing a psychologist would want everyone watching this video to understand. Quagmire is not a special case. His patterns are not rare. His struggles are not unique to him. The fear of vulnerability, the shallow connections, the avoidance of pain, the belief that you can't change, these are universal human experiences. The specifics of Quagmire's story are exaggerated because he's a cartoon character on a comedy show. But the core of his story is real. And it's the core of a lot of people's stories. People who are watching this right now. People who laughed at giggity 1,000 times without ever realizing that the character saying it was a walking illustration of the very things they struggle with themselves. And that's not meant to be depressing. It's actually meant to be the opposite. Because if Quagmire's patterns are recognizable, if they're common, if millions of people deal with the same kinds of struggles in their own ways, then that means you're not alone in dealing with them. Whatever version of Quagmire's pain you carry inside you, other people carry it too. Other people understand it. Other people have faced it and come out the other side. The fact that these patterns are universal means that the solutions are out there too. People have walked this road before. People have closed the gap between knowing and doing. People have broken cycles that felt permanent. People have let others in after a lifetime of keeping them out. It's hard. It's scary. It takes longer than anyone wants it to take. But it happens. Every day. All over the world. Quagmire's story doesn't have a clean ending. As of right now, he's still sitting in that booth at the Drunken Clam, still living in that house on Spooner Street, still saying giggity, still running the same patterns. The show hasn't given him a dramatic moment of change or a big turning point where everything shifts. And maybe it never will. Maybe that's not the kind of show Family Guy is. But the beauty of analyzing a character like this is that the ending doesn't have to be written on screen. You can write it in your own life. You can take the lessons that Quagmire's story teaches and apply them to the patterns you recognize in yourself. You can choose to close the gap that he never closed. You can choose to face the things he never faced. And in doing that, you give his story a meaning that goes far beyond anything the show ever intended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before we wrap this whole thing up, there's one final piece of the puzzle that we need to put into place. We've looked at Quagmire from every angle a psychologist would consider. We've gone through his family, his relationships, his friendships, his inner world, his darkness, his goodness, his potential for change, and the lessons his story teaches. But the question that ties it all together, the one that a psychologist would circle back to at the very end, is this. What would actual treatment look like for someone like Quagmire? If you walked into an office tomorrow and sat down on that couch, what would the process of healing actually involve? And that's exactly where we're going next. Section 10, On the Couch. What treatment would look like for Quagmire? At the end of the last section, we asked the question that a psychologist would naturally arrive at after analyzing everything we've covered. If Glenn Quagmire actually walked into a therapist's office, sat down, and said, "I need help," what would that process actually look like? What would a professional do with everything we've talked about? Where would they start? What would they focus on? And how long would it realistically take to untangle decades of damage, avoidance, and deeply rooted patterns? Now, obviously, Quagmire is a fictional character. He's never going to sit on anyone's couch. But this is an important exercise because it takes everything we've analyzed and puts it into a practical framework. It moves the conversation from, here's what's wrong, to here's what could be done about it. And for anyone watching this who recognize some of Quagmire's patterns in themselves, which is what we talked about in the last section, understanding what the process of change actually looks like can make it feel less scary and more approachable. So let's walk through it, step by step, the way an actual psychologist would approach someone like Glenn Quagmire. The very first thing a psychologist would do is figure out what brought Quagmire into the room in the first place. This might sound obvious, but it's actually one of the most important parts of the whole process. Because people almost never walk into a therapist's office saying, "I'd like to address my deep-seated fear of emotional closeness that stems from my mother using sex as a transactional tool throughout my childhood." That's not how it works. People come in with a surface-level problem, something specific, something recent, something that finally hurt enough to make them pick up the phone and make an appointment. For Quagmire, based on everything the show has given us, the thing that might finally push him through that door could be any number of things. It could be the emptiness he felt after giving up Anna Lee. It could be the aftermath of what happened with Brenda and Jeff. It could be another failed relationship. It could even be something as simple as sitting in his house one night after everyone else has gone home and realizing that he's been doing the same thing for years and nothing has changed. Whatever the trigger is, it would be something specific. Something that cracked the wall just enough for him to admit, even if only to himself, that he needs help. And a good psychologist would start there. They wouldn't immediately jump into Quagmire's childhood, or his family history, or his patterns with women. They'd start with whatever brought him in. They'd let him talk about it. They'd listen. And they'd use that starting point as a doorway into the deeper stuff. Because the surface level problem is almost never the real problem. It's just the tip that's sticking out above the water. The real work is underneath. But you have to start at the tip. You have to meet the person where they are. The next thing a psychologist would focus on, probably in the first few sessions, is building trust. And with Quagmire, this would be one of the biggest challenges of the entire process. Think about everything we've discussed about how Quagmire handles relationships. He keeps everyone at arm's length. He hides behind humor. He deflects when things get too personal. He has spent his entire adult life making sure that nobody gets past the surface.
And now he's sitting in a room with a complete stranger whose entire job is to get past the surface. Every instinct Quagmire has would be screaming at him to put the walls up, to crack a joke, to deflect, to be the giggity version of himself instead of the real one. A good psychologist would expect this. They wouldn't push too hard too fast. They wouldn't try to force Quagmire to open up before he's ready. They would be patient. They would let the trust build naturally over time. They would show Quagmire through consistent, reliable, non-judgmental behavior that this is a safe space, that nothing he says will be used against him, that he won't be rejected or mocked or abandoned for being honest. And eventually, slowly, the walls would start to come down. Not all at once, not in one dramatic moment, but a little bit at a time. A small truth shared in one session, a slightly bigger truth in the next, a real emotion expressed without a joke attached to it for the first time. It would be a slow process, but it would be the most important foundation for everything that comes after. Once that trust is established, a psychologist would start helping Quagmire connect the dots between his past and his present. This is the part of the process where everything we've talked about in this video would come into play. The therapist would gently guide Quagmire towards seeing the connections that he's never been able to see on his own. The connection between his mother Crystal's behavior and his own view of relationships. The connection between his father's transition and his struggles with trust and stability.
The connection between Brenda's suffering and his own fear of what love can do to a person.
The connection between all of these childhood experiences and the adult patterns that have kept him stuck for decades. And this part would be hard. Really hard, because for Quagmire, these aren't abstract ideas. These are real memories, real pain, real people who hurt him or confused him or failed him when he was too young to protect himself. Revisiting that stuff isn't like reading a textbook. It's like opening a wound. And the psychologist would need to be very careful about how quickly they push and how much they ask Quagmire to face at any one time. Go too slow and nothing changes. Go too fast and he shuts down completely, walks out, and never comes back. The balance has to be just right. But assuming Quagmire stays in the process, assuming he doesn't bolt when things get uncomfortable, this is where the real breakthroughs would happen. Because the moment Quagmire truly understands, not just intellectually, but emotionally, that his patterns with women are connected to what his mother taught him, everything shifts. The behavior stops being just who I am and starts being something that happened to me that I can work through. The moment he realizes that his fear of closeness isn't a permanent feature of his personality, but a learned response to a childhood that didn't teach him how to be close to people, the door opens. Not all the way, not immediately, but it opens. And once it's open, the work of actually changing can begin. The next stage of treatment would be about giving Quagmire new skills. Because here's something a lot of people don't realize about therapy. Understanding where your problems come from is important, but it's not enough on its own. You also need to learn how to do things differently. If all therapy did was explain why you're broken, you'd just be a broken person who understands why they're broken. The real value comes from learning new ways to handle the situations that used to trigger your old patterns. For Quagmire, this would mean learning how to be emotionally honest with people. Not in some dramatic, pour your heart out way, just in small, everyday ways. Learning how to say to Peter, actually, I'm not doing great today, instead of making a joke. Learning how to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of immediately looking for a distraction. Learning how to notice when he's falling into an old pattern in real time and choosing to do something different. These are skills. They're not magic, they're not personality changes. They're specific, learnable, practicable skills that anyone can develop with enough time and repetition. And a psychologist would practice these with Quagmire in the room before asking him to try them in real life. They might role-play conversations. They might walk through specific scenarios. Imagine you're at the Clam with Peter and Joe, and Peter asks how you're doing. What do you usually say? Okay, now what could you say instead? It sounds simple. It sounds almost too simple. But for someone like Quagmire, who has spent literally decades responding to that question with a joke or a deflection, saying something real would feel like jumping off a cliff. And practicing it in a safe environment first makes the actual jump less terrifying. The psychologist would also work with Quagmire on something that might be the hardest piece of all: his self-image. We talked in section 5 about how Quagmire has essentially given up on himself. He believes he can't change. He believes the person he is right now is the person he'll always be. And that belief is the engine that keeps every other pattern running. As long as he believes change is impossible, he'll never sustain any effort to change. He'll try, hit a setback, and use the setback as proof that he was right all along. A psychologist would challenge this belief directly, but carefully. They wouldn't just say, "That's not true, you can change." That kind of empty encouragement doesn't work on someone who has years of evidence supporting their negative self-image. Instead, they would use Quagmire's own life as counter-evidence. They would point to Anna Lee. "You say you can't be selfless, but you gave up your own daughter because you loved her enough to put her needs first. That's one of the most selfless things a person can do." They would point to Brenda. "You say you can't love deeply, but you risked everything to protect your sister." They would point to his career. "You say you can't commit to anything, but you've maintained a demanding career for years." Piece by piece, the psychologist would use real moments from Quagmire's actual life to challenge the story he's been telling himself. Not with empty positivity, with evidence, with facts, with things Quagmire himself did that prove his own narrative wrong. And over time, slowly, that internal story would start to shift. Not overnight, not completely, but the cracks would form. The rigid belief that this is who I am and I'll never be different would start to soften. And in those cracks, something new would have room to grow. A belief that maybe, just maybe, the good moments aren't flukes. That maybe the person who loved Anna Lee enough to let her go and the person who protected Brenda at any cost is the real Glenn Quagmire. And the Giggity Act is just the armor he wore because nobody ever told him it was safe to take it off. Now, how long would all of this take? A psychologist would be honest about this. It wouldn't be quick. For someone with Quagmire's level of deep-rooted patterns, we're not talking about a few weeks or even a few months. We're talking about years. Real, sustained, consistent work over a long period of time. There would be setbacks. There would be weeks where Quagmire feels like he's going backward instead of forward. There would be moments where he wants to quit, where the old patterns feel so comfortable and the new ones feel so exhausting that walking away from the whole process seems like the only reasonable option. And the psychologist would be there for all of it. Not judging, not giving up on him. Just being a consistent, reliable presence who keeps showing up, which for someone who's never had that kind of stability in his personal life, might be one of the most healing parts of the whole experience. And would it work? Would Quagmire come out the other side a completely different person? Honestly, probably not. And a good psychologist wouldn't promise that. The goal of therapy isn't to turn someone into a perfect person. It's not to erase every flaw and every struggle and every bad pattern. The goal is to give someone enough awareness, enough skills, and enough belief in themselves that they can make better choices more often. Not every time, not perfectly, but more often than they used to. That's what progress looks like. It's not a straight line from broken to healed. It's a messy, uneven, sometimes frustrating journey from stuck to unstuck. From I can't change to I'm changing, slowly, even when it's hard. For Quagmire, that might mean he still goes to the Drunken Clam. He still flies his planes. He still lives on Spooner Street. But maybe he opens up to Peter one night instead of making a joke. Maybe he lets a relationship go past the second date instead of sabotaging it. Maybe he calls Anna Lee's adoptive family to ask how she's doing. Maybe he looks in the mirror one morning and doesn't hate what he sees. Small things, quiet things, things that nobody watching from the outside would even notice. But things that, for a man who spent decades convinced he was beyond help, would mean absolutely everything. And that, more than anything else, is what a psychologist would want Glenn Quagmire to know. That the giggity doesn't have to be the whole story. That the patterns aren't permanent. That the damage is real, but it's not fatal. That there is a version of his life that looks different from this one, and it's not a fantasy. It's achievable. It would take work, it would take courage, it would take the hardest kind of honesty there is, the kind you aim at yourself. But it's there, waiting for him, whenever he's ready. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this video.
We've looked at Quagmire from almost every angle a psychologist could consider. But before we bring this whole thing to a close, there's one last thing we need to do. We need to pull all of it together. Every section, every argument, every piece of evidence. And we need to answer the question we asked at the very beginning. What would a psychologist really say about Glenn Quagmire? The full answer from start to finish is coming next. Section 11, the full diagnosis. What a psychologist would really say about Glenn Quagmire. At the end of the last section, we said it was time to pull everything together. Every section, every argument, every piece of evidence. Every moment from the show that taught us something about who Glenn Quagmire really is underneath the surface. We've spent a long time with this character. We've gone deeper into his psychology than most people would ever think to go with a character from a comedy show. And now it's time to answer the question that started this entire video. If a psychologist sat down, watched every episode of Family Guy, studied every Quagmire storyline, and then had to give a full assessment of this character, what would they actually say? Let's go through it from the beginning. The first thing a psychologist would establish is where the damage originated. And with Quagmire, the origin is clear. It started in his family. It started with a household that gave him no foundation for understanding what healthy relationships look like. His mother, Crystal Quagmire, taught him from childhood that sex was a tool. It was something you used to fix problems, to get out of trouble, to manipulate outcomes. Every time young Glenn got into difficulty, Crystal didn't teach him accountability or problem solving. She used her body to make the problem disappear. She slept with teachers, principals, and anyone else who stood between her son and consequences. And that lesson, absorbed by a child who didn't know any better, became the blueprint for how Quagmire would approach women and relationships for the rest of his life. Sex became separate from love. Intimacy became separate from emotion. Connection became something shallow and transactional, not something deep and meaningful. A psychologist would say that Crystal didn't just fail her son. She actively programmed him with a broken understanding of one of the most fundamental parts of human life. His father, Dan Quagmire, added a different kind of damage. Dan's transition to Ida Davis in Season 8 wasn't something Glenn was prepared for. It shook his understanding of who his parent was. It destabilized his sense of family identity at a deep level. And for someone who was already struggling with trust and stability, having a parent become someone fundamentally different than the person he thought he knew reinforced a belief that would follow him into adulthood. The belief that the people closest to you can change without warning. That you never really know anyone. That stability is an illusion. A psychologist would note that Glenn did eventually begin to accept Ida, but the initial impact of that revelation left a mark on his ability to trust that the people in his life are who they say they are. And then there was Brenda, his sister, the person who grew up in the same broken household and came out the other side with her own set of damage. Where Glenn learned to avoid deep connection entirely, Brenda went the other direction. She attached herself to Jeff Fiekelman, a man who abused her, controlled her, and hurt her in every way a person can be hurt. And Glenn had to watch that. He had to watch his sister suffer in a relationship that was destroying her, knowing that the same household that broke him broke her too, just in a different way. A psychologist would say that watching Brenda's situation did two things to Quagmire. It confirmed his fear that love is dangerous, and it gave him one more reason to keep his own relationships shallow. Because if that's what deep attachment can lead to, why would anyone risk it? The second thing a psychologist would establish is how that family damage shows up in Quagmire's adult behavior, and the patterns are everywhere. With women, Quagmire follows a cycle that never breaks. He chases short-term encounters endlessly, one after another, because each one gives him a temporary rush that covers up the emptiness inside. But the rush never lasts. So he moves to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. When he actually had the chance at something real, when he married Joan in Season 4, he panicked and ran. The commitment was too much. The vulnerability was too frightening. When he met Sonia in Season 12, someone who mirrored his own behavior back at him, he was terrified by what he saw. And his feelings for Lois, Peter's wife, represent the safest possible form of wanting. He desires someone he can never have, which means he never has to face the scary part of actually being with someone. A psychologist would say that every single one of these patterns traces back to the same root, a deep, overwhelming fear of emotional closeness that was planted in childhood and has been growing stronger every year since. With his friends, the pattern is different, but the cause is the same. Quagmire shows up at the Drunken Clam every day. He sits in the booth, he drinks with Peter, Joe, and whoever else is around. He goes along with their adventures. He's loyal, he's reliable, he's consistently present, but he never opens up. He never shares what's really going on inside his head. He uses humor and deflection to keep every conversation on the surface. His best friend Peter has no idea what Quagmire is actually going through on any given day, and Quagmire likes it that way. A psychologist would say that Quagmire has mastered the art of being around people without being known by them. He has the appearance of friendship without the substance of it, and he maintains this distance because the same fear that keeps his romantic relationships shallow keeps his friendships shallow too. And then there's Brian. Quagmire's hatred of Brian, most famously expressed in that speech from Jerome is the New Black in Season 8, is one of the most psychologically revealing things about his entire character. Because the flaws Quagmire identified in Brian, the hypocrisy, the pretentiousness, the mistreatment of women behind a mask of respect, those are flaws that Quagmire shares. A psychologist would say that Quagmire's intense reaction to Brian is not really about Brian at all. It's about the parts of himself that he can't face. Brian is a mirror, and Quagmire hates what he sees in it. It's easier to attack those flaws in someone else than to acknowledge them in yourself. And that's exactly what Quagmire does. The third thing a psychologist would address is Quagmire's inner world, the part of him that nobody sees. And what's hiding in there is much sadder than the surface suggests. Quagmire's entire sense of self-worth is tied to being a pilot. Take that away, as nearly happened in Airport 07 in Season 5, and he falls apart completely. There's nothing underneath to catch him. The women, the jokes, the catchphrase, none of that gives him real value in his own eyes. It's all noise. And underneath the noise is a man who doesn't think very much of himself at all. The clearest evidence of this came when he found his daughter Anna Lee in Season 8. He tried to be a father. He genuinely tried. But he ultimately decided he wasn't good enough and gave her to a family that could provide what he couldn't. And while that decision showed incredible selflessness and love, it also showed something darker. It showed that Quagmire has accepted his own limitations as permanent. He doesn't believe he can grow. He doesn't believe he can become better. He's decided that this is all he'll ever be, and he's structured his entire life around that belief. A psychologist would say this belief is the single biggest thing holding Quagmire back, more than his family history, more than his patterns, more than his environment. The belief that change is impossible is what makes change impossible. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He believes he can't be different, so he doesn't try. Because he doesn't try, nothing changes. Because nothing changes, his belief gets stronger, and the loop continues. The fourth thing a psychologist would note is Quagmire's relationship with anger and control. When the pain that Quagmire carries inside him builds up too much, it comes out in sudden, intense bursts. The situation with Jeff Fiekelman is the most extreme example. When every reasonable option failed to protect Brenda, Quagmire went to the most extreme option available. The speech to Brian is another example. Years of suppressed self-awareness and self-criticism were redirected outward in one explosive moment. A psychologist would say that these episodes of intense reaction are the inevitable result of chronic emotional suppression. When you push feelings down for long enough, they don't disappear. They build pressure. And when they finally break through, the force is disproportionate to whatever triggered it. The trigger is just the last straw. The weight behind the reaction has been accumulating for years. And the fifth thing, the thing that a psychologist would make sure to emphasize above everything else, is that Quagmire is not a lost cause. Despite everything, despite the broken family, despite the decades of unhealthy patterns, despite the negative self-image, despite the anger and the avoidance and the fear, there is genuine good in Glenn Quagmire. It shows up in his love for Brenda. It shows up in his sacrifice for Anna Lee. It shows up in his dedication to his career. It shows up in his quiet, consistent loyalty to his friends,
even if that loyalty never goes deeper than the surface. The capacity for love, for selflessness, for genuine human connection, it's all still there. It's buried. It's guarded. It's surrounded by walls that have been building for decades. But it's there. A psychologist's final assessment of Glenn Quagmire would sound something like this. This is a man who was given a deeply flawed foundation by his family. That foundation taught him the wrong lessons about love, about sex, about trust, and about what he's worth as a person. He took those lessons into adulthood and built a life around them. A life that looks fun and carefree on the outside, but is actually structured entirely around the avoidance of pain. He uses humor to deflect. He uses shallow relationships to fill a void that can only be filled by something real. He uses his hatred of Brian to avoid looking at himself. He uses his belief that he can't change as a reason to never try. And all of it, every single piece of it, traces back to a family that didn't give him the tools to handle the world in a healthy way. But the assessment wouldn't end there, because a psychologist would also say this. The fact that Quagmire can love his sister the way he does. The fact that he could put his daughter's needs above his own. The fact that he shows up for his friends every single day, even though nobody asked him to. The fact that he's maintained a demanding career that requires real discipline and real responsibility. All of these things are evidence that the damage didn't win. Not completely. There is a version of Glenn Quagmire that is kind, that is brave, that is capable of deep love and real connection. That version exists. It's not a fantasy. It shows up in real moments throughout the show. And if Quagmire could ever find the courage to stop running, to face the pain he's been avoiding, to challenge the story he's been telling himself about who he is, that version of him could become the main version, not the exception. Not the rare glimpse, the everyday reality. That's what a psychologist would say about Glenn Quagmire. Not that he's broken beyond repair, not that he's a bad person hiding behind a funny catchphrase, but that he's a good person trapped inside patterns that were never his fault to begin with, and that the key to his freedom has been in his hands the entire time. He just hasn't realized it yet, and maybe he never will. He's a cartoon character. The writers get to decide. But the lessons his story carries are real, and for anyone watching who sees even a small piece of themselves in what we've described today, the key is in your hands too. And unlike Quagmire, you get to decide what happens next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before we close this out entirely, there's one last thing I want to leave you with. Because after everything we've covered, after 10 sections of deep analysis and thousands of words about one fictional man's psychology, there's a final thought that ties this whole thing together in a way that I think matters more than any individual section on its own. Section 12, The Man in the Hawaiian Shirt, a final reflection. At the end of the last section, we said there was one final thought that ties this whole video together. One idea that sits above everything else we've covered and gives it all a meaning that goes beyond just analyzing one character from one show. And that's what this section is about. Not another breakdown of episodes or scenes or storylines. We've done that. We've gone through it all. This is about stepping back from the details and looking at the full picture of what Glenn Quagmire's story actually represents. Because after spending all this time inside this character's head, after examining every layer and every pattern and every wound, the thing that strikes me the most isn't any single episode or any single moment. It's something much simpler than that. And it's something that I think everyone watching this can understand. Glenn Quagmire is lonely. That's it. That's the thing underneath everything. Underneath the giggity. Underneath the jokes. Underneath the Hawaiian shirt and the pilot's uniform and the endless parade of women and the booth at the Drunken Clam. Underneath the speech to Brian and the anger at Jeff Fiekelman and the love for Brenda and the heartbreak of giving up Anna Lee. Underneath all of it, at the very bottom of everything we've talked about, is a man who is profoundly, deeply, overwhelmingly lonely, and who has been lonely for so long that he doesn't even recognize it as loneliness anymore. It's just the background noise of his life. It's just the way things are. It's just the feeling that's always there when he wakes up in the morning, and always there when he goes to sleep at night, and always there in between, no matter how many people he surrounds himself with, or how loud the laughter at the bar gets, or how
many times he says giggity to get a reaction from the room. And the cruelest part of Quagmire's loneliness is that it's entirely self-created. Not on purpose, not because he chose it, but because every defense mechanism he built to protect himself from pain ended up isolating him instead. He keeps women at arm's length to avoid getting hurt, and the result is that he's never been truly close to a romantic partner. He keeps his friends on the surface to avoid being vulnerable, and the result is that Peter and Joe don't actually know who he is. He pushes away opportunities for real connection the moment they appear. And the result is that his house on Spooner Street is empty every night when the lights go out. Every wall he built to keep the pain out also keeps the love out. Every shield he raised to protect himself from the world also blocks the world from reaching him. He is the architect of his own isolation, and he doesn't even know it. A psychologist would look at Quagmire's life and see one of the most common and one of the saddest things they encounter in their work. A person who is desperately hungry for connection, but who has built their entire life in a way that makes connection impossible. It's like being thirsty while sitting next to a river, but being too afraid to drink because someone once told you the water was poisoned. The river is right there. The water is fine. But the fear is real, even if the danger isn't. And so you sit there, thirsty, watching the water flow past, convincing yourself that you're not that thirsty anyway. That's Quagmire. The connection is right there. Peter is right there, and he would listen if Quagmire actually talked to him. Joe is right there, and he would understand if Quagmire actually opened up. The possibility of a real relationship with someone is out there, and it could work if Quagmire actually lets someone in. Everything he needs is within arm's reach, but the arm won't extend. The walls won't come down. The act won't drop, and so the loneliness continues. And this is where I want to bring it back to something real. Because loneliness isn't just a Quagmire problem. It's not just a fictional character problem. It's one of the biggest problems facing actual human beings right now. Everywhere, in every country, in every age group, people are lonelier than they've ever been. And not because they're alone. That's the part that most people get wrong. Loneliness isn't about being by yourself. You can be alone and perfectly content. Loneliness is about feeling disconnected from the people around you, even when they're right there. It's about being in a room full of friends and still feeling like nobody knows the real you. It's about having a phone full of contacts and not knowing who you'd call if you actually needed to talk about something that mattered. It's about performing a version of yourself for the world while the real version stays locked away where nobody can see it. That's what Quagmire does every single day. And that's what millions of real people do every single day too. They go to work. They hang out with friends. They scroll through their phones. They laugh at the right moments and say the right things and perform the version of themselves that the world expects. And then they go home and the performance stops. And the quiet sets in, and the loneliness is right there waiting for them, just like it always is. Family Guy never frames it this way. The show never has a scene where Quagmire sits in his living room and stares at the wall, and the audience is asked to feel sad about it. That's not the kind of show it is. But you can feel it between the lines, if you're paying attention. You can feel it in the gap between the Quagmire who shows up at the clam and the Quagmire who goes home alone. You can feel it in the difference between how loud his life seems and how empty it actually is. You can feel it in the moments where the mask cracks just a little, where the real person peeks through for a second before the act snaps back into place. It's there. It's always been there. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I think that's why this analysis matters. Not because Quagmire is a particularly important character in the history of television, not because Family Guy is secretly a deep psychological drama disguised as a comedy, but because Quagmire's story, when you actually look at it, is the story of loneliness itself. It's the story of what happens when a person is hurt early in life and spends the rest of their years building walls that protect them from more hurt, while simultaneously preventing them from getting the one thing that would actually heal them. Connection. Real, honest, vulnerable, messy, scary, imperfect, human connection. That's what would heal Quagmire. Not therapy alone, although therapy would help. Not a new relationship, although a real one could change his life. Not a new job, or a new house, or a new city. Connection. One real conversation with Peter,
where he says what he's actually feeling instead of making a joke.
One real moment with someone where he doesn't perform and doesn't deflect and doesn't hide behind the character he's built. One moment of being truly seen by another person and discovering that it doesn't destroy him. That's what it would take.
And it's so simple, and it's so close, and it's the one thing he can't bring himself to reach for. The Hawaiian shirt is his armor. The giggity is his shield. The endless chase is his distraction. And behind all of it is just a guy. A guy who grew up in a house that didn't teach him how to be loved. A guy who turned into a man that doesn't know how to let himself be loved. A guy who fills every second of his life with noise because the silence is unbearable. A guy who is so afraid of being seen that he made himself the loudest person in the room, because if everyone is looking at the performance, nobody is looking at the person. And a psychologist would sit with that. They wouldn't try to fix it in one session. They wouldn't have a magic answer. They would just sit with it. And they would say something that Glenn Quagmire has probably never heard from anyone in his entire life. Not from his mother, not from his father, not from Peter or Joe or any of the women who have come and gone. They would say, "I see you. Not the act, not the character, you. And you don't have to perform here. You can just be who you are." And that's enough. That's enough. 2 words that could change everything for someone like Quagmire. 2 words that most people who are stuck in his kind of patterns have never believed about themselves. That who they are, the real them, the unperformed and unprotected version that they keep hidden from the world, is enough. That they don't need the armor. That they don't need the shield. That they don't need to be louder or funnier or more impressive or more anything. That the person underneath all of that is worthy of love and connection and belonging just as they are. Quagmire has never believed that. And because he's never believed it, he's never stopped performing. He's never taken the armor off. He's never let anyone see what's underneath. And the loneliness has continued. Year after year, season after season, giggity after giggity. But here's the thing I want to leave you with. Quagmire's story doesn't have to be your story. If you recognized anything in this video, anything at all, whether it was the fear of vulnerability, the surface level friendships, the endless distractions, the quiet belief that you're not enough, or just the simple, crushing weight of feeling lonely even when you're not alone, then you already have something that Quagmire doesn't. You have awareness. Real awareness. Not the partial kind that Quagmire shows in his best moments. The full kind. The kind that comes from watching someone else's patterns and recognizing your own. And awareness, real awareness, is the first step toward everything changing. You don't have to stay in the booth. You don't have to keep wearing the shirt. You don't have to keep performing for the room. The river is right there, and the water is fine. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe. I have another video essay coming soon that goes just as deep into another topic you are going to love. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.